You stepped carefully, placing each foot with the slow habit of a man who knows the path well, but respects the slipperiness of wet stone. The crunch of your boot soles on the cinders was a steady, quiet rhythm, the only sound you made besides the occasional rustle of your coat when you shifted the bag on your shoulder. From further down the cutting, from the direction of the tunnel mouth, came the faintest drip of water, a sound so distant and muffled by the enclosing walls that it felt like something remembered rather than heard. The temperature dropped as you descended, the air becoming heavier and damper, carrying the smell of cold stone and old soot, and the faint metallic tang of the rails that ran along the bottom of the cutting. A thin mist, not yet a proper fog, hung in ribbons just above the ballast, curling lazily around the signal wires that sagged between their posts. As you rounded a slight bend in the path, the signal box came into view below you, a small wooden cabin set on a brick base at the side of the track. It was painted in dark colors, the kind of brownish green that railway companies used for their structures, and it sat in the gloom of the cutting like a quiet animal waiting for the night. The windows glowed with a soft, steady light, the lantern you had lit before your first round of duties catching the glass and throwing a faint warmth into the grey air. Seeing it there, a small square of light in the deep shadow of the cutting, you felt the same small settling of the spirit that you always felt at the beginning of a shift. A recognition of the hours ahead as a space apart from the world above. You shifted the bag again and continued down the last steep section of the path, your boots crunching and sliding a little on the loose stones until you stepped onto the level ground beside the track. The cutting was deeper than it seemed from above, its walls rising 30 or 40 feet on both sides, their tops lost now in the thickening mist. Looking up, you could see only a narrow strip of sky the color of slate, and even that was beginning to blur at the edges as the fog thickened. The rails gleamed faintly in the lantern light, two parallel lines of polished steel that curved gently towards the black mouth of Box Tunnel to the east. To the west, the line ran straight for a short distance before bending around a shoulder of rock and disappearing into the fog. Everything was still, as if the cutting were a room closed off from the rest of the world, insulated by the damp limestone and the gathering mist. You walked the short distance to the signal box, passing the tall post with its cluster of signal arms hanging dark against the grey sky, their red and green spectacle plates covered for the moment. The wooden steps up to the door were worn smooth in the middle from years of use, and they creaked under your weight in a way that was as familiar as a house settling at night. Inside the box, the warmth from the small coal stove met you at the door, drawing the chill from your face and hands. The lantern on the wall bracket had burned steadily while you were away, its flame perfectly still behind the sooted glass chimney. You hung your coat on the wooden peg by the door and placed your canvas bag on the shelf beneath a narrow window that faced the track. The box was a small space, perhaps 8 feet by 6, with a desk built against the window wall and the stove in the opposite corner on a sheet of iron. On the wall above the desk hung the block telegraph instruments in their brass cases, their needles motionless, and beside them a plain wooden clock ticked with a slow, patient beat. The lever frame stood in the center of the floor, a row of tall iron levers painted in colors that had dulled over time to shades of earthy brown and faded green and soft red. Each lever had a brass plate at its base, engraved with a number and a description of its function, and the whole frame smelled faintly of oil and metal. You stood for a moment in the center of the small room, listening to the clock and the gentle hiss of the stove, and the distant drip of water that came through the slightly open window, a ventilation gap you always left to keep the air from growing too close. Then you moved through the routine that you had performed 100 times and would perform 100 times more. You checked the coal bucket beside the stove and added 3 small lumps with the iron scoop, settling them carefully so that they would burn slowly through the evening. You checked the water level in the small kettle that sat on the stovetop, topping it up from the stoneware jug you kept in the corner. You wiped the desk with the rag that hung from a nail, removing the fine dust that had settled since the morning shift. Each small action was done without hurry, with the same deliberate attention that you gave to the signals and the levers, because the routine was part of the job, the steady, quiet structure of the night. You sat on the wooden stool by the window and looked out at the track. The fog had grown noticeably even in the short time you had been inside, filling the cutting from wall to wall with a grey so dense that the tunnel mouth was no longer visible. The gas lamps on the signal post cast blurred circles of light that seemed to float in the murk without any visible attachment to the post itself. A single drop of condensation ran slowly down the outside of the window pane, leaving a trail like a snail's path, and you watched it until it reached the wooden frame and disappeared. The clock ticked. The stove made a small settling noise as one of the coals shifted. Somewhere far away beyond the tunnel and the hill, a dog barked once and then was silent, the sound reaching you only because the fog pressed everything downwards, muffling the world into a smaller, quieter shape. You poured a cup of tea from the flask into the tin cup that hung on a hook by the shelf, the steam rising in a thin white curl and the warmth of the metal seeping into your palms. The tea was still hot, strong and dark, with a little sugar you had stirred in at home, and you drank it slowly, looking out through the window at the gathering night. The November fog was a living thing, you thought, not dramatically, but in the slow, calm way that you thought about everything on these long shifts. It moved without wind, thickening and thinning in response to changes in temperature you could not feel, and it brought with it a particular kind of silence that was different from the silence of a clear night. On a clear night, you could hear sounds from the villages in the valley, the distant rumble of a cart on a road, the bark of a fox, the occasional whistle of a train on a far-off line. But in the fog, all those sounds were absorbed, and the only noises were those immediately around you: the drip of water, the ticking of the clock, the soft breathing of the stove. You set the empty cup aside and took down the train register from its shelf, a thick ledger bound in dark cloth with marbled edges. You opened it to the current page, smoothing the paper flat, and read the entries made by the day signalman in his neat, slanting hand. The 2:15 Colton 15 goods had passed at 2:22, 7 minutes late. The 4:40 local passenger had passed on time at 4:40. The 15:10 up mail had been signalled, but not yet arrived when he had handed over to you. There was a small note in the margin about a points check and the comment on the wind direction, which had been southwesterly and light. You read the entries twice, as you always did, ensuring that you understood the state of the line as the dayman had left it. Then you dipped the pen in the inkwell and wrote your own first entry, the date, November 16th, 1875, and the time, 5:45 p.m., and the words, "Assumed duty, line clear to Chippenham, fog thickening," in your own handwriting, which was slower and less neat than the dayman's but still legible. You blotted the ink carefully and closed the ledger, leaving it on the desk where it would be easy to reach when the mail train was signalled. The telegraph bell rang a single soft note, the needle on the instrument twitching and settling. It was the call attention signal from the box towards Bath, a brief pulse that meant nothing urgent, just a presence on the line. You reached up and tapped the key in response, a single click, acknowledging that you were here, that the line was attended, that all was as it should be. The needle trembled slightly before falling still again, and you settled back on your stool, your hands resting loosely in your lap. The light from the lantern fell on the polished wood of the desk and on the brass work of the instruments, creating small highlights that shifted when you moved your head. Beyond the glass, the world had become entirely dark, the fog so thick that even the nearest signal lamp was now only a vague red smudge, a colour without a source. The cutting had closed in around you, and the night had truly begun. You thought briefly of the cottage, of the lamp you had left burning in the window, of the quiet supper you had eaten before walking out into the grey afternoon, and then you let those thoughts drift away, as you always did, setting them aside for the morning. For now, there was only the box, and the instruments, and the long, slow hours of the November night ahead. You sat and watched the fog through the window, waiting for the first distant vibration that would announce the approach of the night mail, and the cutting was silent around you, holding its breath in the deep, patient darkness. The stove had been drawing well since you arrived, its small iron door glowing a dull red at the edges, and the warmth it gave filled the signal box with a dry, steady comfort. You opened the door carefully with the hooked iron handle, the metal cool enough to touch only at the very end, and looked inside at the bed of coals. Most had burned down to a deep orange mass fringed with grey ash, but a few dark lumps still held their shape in the corners, waiting to be stirred. You took the small brass poker from its hook on the side of the stove and pushed the coals gently, settling them into a more even bed, watching the brief flare of brighter orange as new air reached the embers. The heat came against your face in a soft wave, carrying the faint smell of soot and hot iron, and you stayed there for a moment, your hands held out towards the warmth, listening to the small sounds the stove was making. As the metal expanded, it produced a quiet series of ticks, a random rhythm of tiny pings and creaks that you had come to associate with the beginning of every shift, the cabin adjusting itself to the heat after a day of slow cooling. You took the iron scoop from the coal bucket and selected 3 pieces of coal, each about the size of your fist, placing them carefully on the glowing bed, with a gentle clink that sent up a small shower of sparks before the new lumps settled in and began to blacken on their undersides. The fire would hold steady now for several hours, and you closed the little door, latching it with the familiar click that meant the stove was sealed and safe. Outside, the fog had been waiting. You knew it was out there even before you opened the door, because the single window in the box had turned entirely opaque, not with frost, but with a grey blankness that pressed against the glass like a solid thing. It was time to light the signal lamps, a task that you performed at the same moment every evening, give or take a few minutes depending on the thickness of the weather. On a clear summer night, you might wait until the last of the daylight had faded from the western sky. But in November, and in fog like this, you lit them early, giving any approaching driver the best chance of seeing the red or green that told him whether the line ahead was clear or blocked. You stood from the stool and took your coat from the peg, a heavy woolen garment that smelled faintly of lanolin and coal smoke, and you buttoned it up to your chin before pulling the cap down over your ears. From the shelf you lifted the small lamp-lighting box, a wooden case containing a tin of paraffin, a roll of cotton wick, a pair of brass scissors, and several clean rags, and you tucked it under your arm. You blew out the lantern on the wall bracket for safety while the door was open, and then you pushed the door handle down and stepped out into the cutting. The change was immediate and total. Where the box had been a small pocket of dry warmth and limited sight, the cutting was a world of cold moisture and profound grey. The fog had thickened so much since your arrival that it felt like walking into a different season, the air so saturated with water droplets that your face was damp before you had taken 3 steps. The fog drifted in heavy, slow-moving banks that filled the cutting from the rock wall on one side to the rock wall on the other, and it reached upwards to a height far above the top of the signal post, so that there was no longer any division between earth and sky overhead, only a uniform greyness that seemed to have no limit. Sound behaved strangely inside it. The crunch of your boots on the cinders was muffled almost to nothing, as though you were walking on layers of felt, and the distant drip of water from the tunnel mouth, which had been faint before, was now entirely absent, swallowed by the damp air. Even the rails, which had gleamed with reflected lantern light an hour earlier, were now just 2 dark lines that vanished into the grey after only a few feet, their polished heads filmed with a fine layer of condensation. You walked the short distance to the signal post, your boots finding the familiar path by memory as much as by sight, and you set the lamp box on the gravel at the base of the ladder. The ladder was made of iron, bolted to the wooden post, and its rungs were always cold, but tonight the cold was sharpened by the wetness that coated every surface. You put a hand on the rail and felt the moisture under your palm, a slick coldness that made you grip more firmly before you began to climb. Each rung took you higher into the fog, and with every step the greyness seemed to close in a little more, until by the time you reached the small platform at the top, you could no longer see the ground or the signal box or anything else below you. The platform was a simple wooden grating, just large enough for one man to stand on, with an iron railing at waist height that you held onto as you steadied yourself. Up here the fog was a living presence, moving in slow swirls that you could watch, if you fixed your eyes on one point, the individual droplets too small to see, but their collective motion visible as a gentle, endless drift. The signal lamps hung on brackets just above your head, 2 of them, the top lamp showing a red spectacle plate and the lower one a green, though both were dark now and would remain so until you had done your work. You reached up and unlatched the first lamp, the one for the home signal, and brought it down carefully onto the platform, holding it steady between your knees as you opened the small door that gave access to the burner. The burner was a simple brass tube with a wick slot at the top, the old wick still sitting in its groove, blackened and crusted from the previous night's burning. You lifted the old wick out with your fingernails, dropping it into the small waste box you carried in your pocket, and then you measured a length of new cotton wick against the groove, cutting it with the brass scissors so that it sat flush with the top of the burner when you pushed it gently into place. The cotton was soft and white in your damp fingers, a small bright thing in the grayness, and you threaded it carefully into the slot, making sure it was straight and even before you moved to the reservoir. The lamp's reservoir was a brass container at the base, filled with paraffin that you could smell as soon as you unscrewed the filler cap. A clean, sharp odor that cut through the dampness of the fog. You took the small tin of paraffin from your box and poured it in a thin, steady stream, watching the level rise against the little glass window on the side until it reached the fill line, and then you capped it tightly and wiped the outside with one of your rags until the brass was dry and faintly shining. You repeated the whole process for the second lamp, the one with the green spectacle, working with the same slow care, because a poorly trimmed wick could smoke and blacken the glass, reducing the light to a dim flicker that a driver might miss, especially in weather like this. When both reservoirs were filled and both wicks were fresh, you lit them one after the other, using the small brass lighter that lived in your waistcoat pocket, its flint throwing a tiny shower of sparks before the wick caught and a steady flame grew upwards, yellow at the tip and blue at the base. You adjusted the flames with the little thumb wheel that raised and lowered the wicks, watching the way the light filled the colored glass of the spectacle plates, the top one a deep, rich red, and the lower one a clear emerald green. In the fog, the colors were transformed into soft, blurred circles that seemed to float independent of the lamps themselves. The red, a warm smudge, and the green, a cooler one, both of them hazy at the edges and pulsing very slightly as the flames settled into their steady burn. You cleaned the outside of the glass with a fresh rag, wiping away the fine film of moisture that had already formed, and then you hung the lamps back on their brackets, checking that each one was secure, and that the spectacle plates were facing correctly along the line towards the east, where any approaching train would first see them. You stood on the platform for a long moment, your hands resting on the damp railing, and you tried to see down into the cutting, where the tunnel mouth should have been, a great dark arch that you knew was less than 200 yards away. There was now only a wall of grey fog so dense that it could have been 10 feet away or 1,000, giving no sense of distance or scale. The rails that curved towards Bath were similarly lost, the whole western end of the cutting erased, as if the world ended at the edge of the platform and beyond it there was nothing but this soft, muffling grey. A single drop of water gathered on the brim of your cap and fell onto the back of your hand, startlingly cold, and you realized that your face was wet, your eyebrows beaded with moisture, your coat covered in a fine silvery layer of droplets that had settled from the fog without you noticing. You wiped your face with the sleeve of your coat, a slow, automatic gesture, and then you took one last look at the signal lamps, at their steady red and green glows burning faithfully in the murk. The colors were the only colors in the cutting now, two small points of life in the vast grayness, and you felt the same quiet satisfaction that you always felt at this moment, the knowledge that the lamps were lit and burning cleanly, that the signal was visible, that you had done your work properly. Then you turned, gripped the cold wet rails of the ladder, and began the slow climb back down, testing each rung with your foot before committing your weight, the iron creaking slightly under your hands. At the bottom, the signal box was only a darker shape in the fog, but its window glowed softly from the lantern you had relit in your mind, though actually you had blown it out earlier and would need to relight it once inside. You picked up your lamp box and walked back to the cabin, your boots crunching on the cinders with the same muffled sound. The door opened with its familiar creak, and you stepped inside, closing it quickly behind you to keep the warmth in. The stove still glowed, the room still smelled of coal and oil and old wood, and you set about the small rituals of return, hanging your damp coat on its peg, relighting the wall lantern with the brass lighter, placing the lamp box back on its shelf, pouring a fresh cup of tea from the flask which was still warm. You pulled the stool close to the window again and sat down, your hands wrapping around the tin cup, and you looked out through the glass that was now slightly steamed on the inside from your breath and the stove's heat. The fog pressed against the pane, featureless and patient, and the red and green lamps above it were two soft smears of color that seemed to have been there forever. The clock ticked, the stove ticked. Somewhere in the rock wall outside, Water dripped with a plink that was so quiet and so regular that it became, after a minute, indistinguishable from silence. You sat and waited, the night settling down around the cutting like a blanket, and the first hours of your shift passed in the slow, calm way they always did, one moment folding into the next without hurry. The warmth of the stove had settled into a steady, gentle heat that filled the small signal box, making the air inside comfortable and dry in a way that was entirely separate from the damp grey pressing against the window panes. You sat on the wooden stool for a time, letting the cold that had seeped into your fingers during the lamp lighting slowly ease away, your hands wrapped loosely around the tin cup that was still faintly warm from the tea. The clock on the wall ticked with its unhurried beat, the pendulum a dark brass disc that swung behind a small glass door, its motion so regular that after a while you stopped noticing it, the sound becoming part of the silence rather than an interruption of it. Outside, the fog remained as thick as before, the red and green signal lamps still visible as two soft blurs of color that seemed to float without source or distance. You finished the tea, set the cup aside on the shelf, and turned your attention to the instruments that hung on the wall above the desk. The block telegraph instruments were the heart of the signal box, the means by which you spoke to the other signalman along the line without ever raising your voice or leaving your seat. They were housed in two brass cases, each polished by years of hands and cloths, until the metal glowed with a deep, muted shine that caught the lantern light in a warm gold band at the top edge. The larger case contained the block indicator, a circular dial with a single needle that could point to one of three positions: line clear, line blocked, or train on line. The needle was black, slender and finely balanced, and it rested now in the vertical position that meant line blocked, where you had left it when you took over the shift after confirming the section was clear behind the last train. Beside the indicator, a smaller brass box held the telegraph bell and key. The bell, a small dome of polished metal with a striker inside that gave a single clear note whenever the signalman at one of the adjacent boxes sent a signal along the wire. The key was a simple brass lever with a rounded wooden knob, worn smooth by the constant pressure of fingers, and it moved with a light, precise action that you knew as well as the feel of your own boots. You had not yet spoken to the other boxes during this shift, and the first act of communication was a small ritual that always brought a quiet sense of connection, a reminder that you were not entirely alone in the fog. You reached up and placed your thumb and forefinger on the wooden knob of the key, its surface cool and smooth, and you pressed it down once with a deliberate, gentle motion. The key moved perhaps half an inch, meeting the contact inside with a soft click, and somewhere down the line, in a signal box many miles away towards Chippenham, a single bell note would have rung out, a clean metallic tone cutting through the quiet of another small cabin, not unlike your own. That single beat was the call attention signal, the telegraphic equivalent of clearing your throat before speaking, and it asked without words whether anyone was listening. You released the key and waited. The needle in the block indicator remained still, but you kept your eyes on it because you knew the reply, when it came, would arrive as a movement of that needle first. The fast signalman acknowledging your presence by deflecting the indicator before he sent his bell code. The clock ticked 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. Then, with a faint whirring sound that was somewhere between a click and a buzz, the needle jumped from the vertical line-blocked position to the right, pointing for a single second at line clear, and then dropped back again. A moment later, the telegraph bell on your wall rang twice, 2 clear notes in quick succession, the sound small and bright in the confined space of the box. 2 beats. That was the bell code for line clear, coming from the Chippenham direction, telling you that the signalman there had heard your call and was declaring his section free of trains. You acknowledged it silently, your hand already moving back to the key, and you pressed it once more. A single beat that said, "I have understood." The exchange was complete in its simplest form, a brief conversation conducted in a language of beats and needle movements that had remained unchanged for decades. Now it was time to set the block for your own section, the formal declaration that the line between your box and the next one was closed to all traffic until you chose to open it again. This was always the first real action of a shift after the initial acknowledgements, a precaution that ensured no train could enter your length of track without your permission. You rested your fingers on the key and began to tap out the bell code for line blocked. 2 beats, a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, and then a single beat. The rhythm was slow and deliberate. The 2 beats a pair of soft, distinct sounds, like a door closing twice. The pause a held breath, and the final single beat a full stop. Your hand moved with the ease of long practice, the arc of the key emotion so familiar that you could have performed it in total darkness. At the far box, the signalman would be listening to the same rhythm, counting the beats, understanding the message, without having to think about it. You waited, and the reply came back like a distant echo, the same pattern of 2 beats, pause, 1 beat, repeated faithfully by the man at the Chippenham box to confirm that he had set his instruments to match yours and that he too was now showing line, blocked on his side. His needle in his own indicator would be pointing to the same vertical position as yours, a locked agreement stretching along miles of fog-shrouded wire. The telegraph bell fell silent, and you sat back slightly on the stool, your hands coming to rest on your knees. The first formalities of the shift were done, the invisible link between 2 small wooden cabins established, and the line was now officially under your care. You opened the train register where it lay on the desk and made another entry, the nib of the pen scratching softly on the thick paper. You wrote the time, which was now a few minutes past 6 o'clock, and the words "block signal exchange with Chippenham, line blocked, fog unchanged," in your slow, careful script. The ink gleamed wetly for a moment, before you blotted it with the sheet of pink blotting paper that was tucked into the back of the ledger, and then you closed the book and returned it to its place, aligning its corners with the edge of the desk in a small act of orderliness that pleased you. The instruments were alive now, no longer silent objects on the wall, but parts of a living system that extended far beyond the cutting. The needle in the block indicator trembled occasionally, tiny vibrations that you could see if you looked closely, the result of distant electrical currents moving through the wires that ran alongside the track. Sometimes the needle would give a single sharp flick and then settle, a phantom movement caused by a wet branch touching the line somewhere or a gust of wind in a place far away where the fog was thinner. These random twitches were part of the background of the shift, meaningless in themselves, but proof that the telegraph circuit was complete, that the current was flowing, that the wires were still intact. You watched the needle idly, your chin resting on your hand, your eyes half focused on the brass case with its circular dial and its 3 painted words in small, neat letters. The clock on the wall continued its steady work, the pendulum swinging back and forth in its glass-fronted case, the hands moving in imperceptible increments around the cream-coloured face. It was a simple clock, made in Clerkenwell and sold to the railway company in a batch of 20, its wooden case stained dark and polished to a subdued shine. Every 3 minutes the mechanism gave a small preparatory whir before the manet hand clicked forward, and if you were listening you could catch it, a faint sound like the drawing of a gentle breath. The clock had been regulated to keep near perfect time, checked weekly against the standard clock at Paddington via the telegraph at noon, and you trusted it completely, using its face to mark the passage of trains and the filling in of the register as much as the gradual shifting of the darkness beyond the window. You rose from the stool after a while, not because anything needed doing, but because the small space of the box invited a change of posture from time to time, a stretch of the legs, a different view through the window. You stood by the glass and looked out into the fog, which seemed to have grown even denser, if such a thing were possible. The red and green blurs of the signal lamps now so diffuse that they might have been coloured mist rather than distinct lights. The patch of gravel directly below the window was visible, the cinders pale grey against the darker grey of the fog, but beyond a few feet there was nothing but blankness. You could see your own reflection in the glass when you shifted your head, a faint outline of a face under a cap, and you watched it for a moment before turning back to the room. The stove had burned down slightly, and you added 2 more lumps of coal, the scoop clinking against the iron sides, the fresh lumps settling onto the glowing bed with a soft crunch. You poured another cup of tea from the flask, the liquid now only lukewarm but still comforting, and you drank it standing up, leaning one shoulder against the wooden wall near the lever frame. The levers stood in their row, tall and silent, their painted handles dulled by age to colours that were more suggestion than statement, a faded green for the distant signal, a faded red for the home, a faded black for the points. Each lever was connected by a system of rods and wires to its corresponding apparatus out in the cutting, and when you pulled one, you felt the distant resistance of the signal arm moving, a sensation that was transmitted back through the metal and into your hand as a slight increase in pressure before the catch engaged. For now, the levers were at rest, their heavy iron weights holding the signal arms at danger, which was the safe position, the default state of the railway when no train was expected. You finished the tea and returned the cup to its hook, wiping the rim with your sleeve out of habit. Then you sat down again, adjusting the stool so that you could rest your elbows on the desk, your face close to the block instruments. The brass cases gave off the faint smell of warmed metal, a clean scent that mixed with the coal-tinged air and the lingering trace of paraffin from your coat still hanging by the door. You let your eyes rest on the block indicator, watching the needle as one might watch a slow river, expecting nothing but attentive to everything. The clock ticked. The stove made a small settling sound as one of the coals shifted and collapsed. Somewhere in the cutting, water dripped with a plink that arrived at your ears as softly as a memory. Time passed in the way it always passed during these long, still periods between communications, not measured so much as accumulated, layer upon layer of quiet minutes. You thought about the fog and the way it changed the cutting into a place that no longer seemed part of the same world as the villages and fields above, how it turned the railway into a closed system bounded by grey walls that moved when you tried to look at them. You thought about the night mail train that was somewhere to the east, being made up at Paddington or already on its way, a string of lit carriages cutting through the same fog you were sitting inside, the driver leaning from his cab to watch for the signals that you had lit. But the thoughts were not urgent. They drifted through your mind without demanding attention, and you let them come and go as they pleased, the way a man does when he has many hours ahead of him and nothing to do but wait. The telegraph bell rang a single note, clear and sudden, pulling you gently back from the edge of reverie. It was the call attention signal again, this time from the west, from the box at Bath. You sat up a little straighter, your hand moving to the key, and you pressed it once in reply. A moment later, the bell rang again. 3 beats, a pause, 1 beat. You recognized the code immediately, as any signalman would, the distinctive rhythm that meant the down-mail train was entering the section from Bath, on its way towards you. The needle in the block indicator swung to the right, pointing to train on line, and you rose from the stool, your body moving before your mind had fully formed the thought, ready to attend to the levers and the signals and the approach of the train through the thick, muffling fog. With the window open a crack, the fog crept in as a faint coolness against your cheek, a slow, imperceptible movement of damp air that carried no scent of earth or grass, only the clean, neutral smell of water suspended. The opening was narrow, no wider than your thumb, but it was enough to let the outside world into the box in the form of sound, and you kept it that way throughout every shift, regardless of the temperature, because a signalman who could not hear was a signalman working half-blind. You tilted your head slightly, your ear towards the gap, and you let the quiet at the cutting come to you. The first sound, the one that was always there, was the dripping of water. It came from the overhanging ledges of limestone that framed the cutting, from the moss that held moisture like a sponge, and released it in slow, heavy drops that fell onto the ballast below. Each drop landed with a soft, musical plink that was never quite the same pitch as the one before it, a note that varied according to the depth of the pool it struck or the size of the stone it hit, so that the overall effect was of a random, gentle music played on a single string. The drips were spaced apart by intervals of quiet that lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, sometimes longer when the moss was less saturated, and the sound was so regular in its irregularity that it became, after a while, something you felt rather than heard, a background texture that your mind no longer registered as separate events, but as a continuous presence. Beyond the dripping, further back in the layers of audible distance, you could sometimes catch the faint, high call of a night bird. It was a single note, a brief, clear piping that rose from somewhere on the hillside far above the cutting, and it came only once, or perhaps twice in an hour, a sound so isolated that it seemed to have no connection to any living creature. The bird was most likely a tawny owl, you thought, though you had never seen it and could not be certain. And it called not in the rhythmic hooting that people associated with owls, but in a short, sharp key-wick that cut through the fog for a moment and then vanished, leaving a silence that seemed deeper than before. The bird was a solitary creature, awake while others slept, and its call was a solitary sound, a question that expected no answer, and you listened for it without looking, your eyes still on the instruments, your ear still at the crack of the window. The cutting itself was a funnel for noise, its high rock walls capturing even the smallest sound from miles away and carrying it along the track bed as if through a stone pipe. You had noticed this phenomenon many times before, on clear nights when the distant whistle of a train 10 miles off would reach you with startling clarity, bounced and channeled through the confines of the excavation. But in the fog the effect was different. The moist air absorbed the higher frequencies and left only the lower ones, so that what you heard was a reduced, bass-heavy version of the world. A distant steam engine laboring up the incline beyond, Bath reached you not as a chuffing or a whistle, but as a low, continuous whisper that seemed to come from no particular direction, a sound you felt in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. It was a stationary pumping engine you knew, used to supply water to a depot, and it worked day and night with a steady, unchanging rhythm that was more like a geological process than a machine, a deep thrum that had been going on for years and would go on for years, would go on for years more, indifferent to fog or rain or the passing of trains. You strained your ears now and then for the first hint of the mail train. You knew it was coming, the telegraph having told you so, but the sound of its approach was still absent, swallowed by the miles of fog that lay between Bath and your cutting. The down mail was a heavy train, pulled by a powerful locomotive, and on a clear night you could hear it from 3 or 4 miles away, a distant rumble that grew steadily into a roar. Tonight, however, there was nothing. No rumble, no vibration, no distant blow on the underside of the fog. The silence was complete in that regard, and you accepted it, because the train would come in its own time, and no amount of listening would bring it sooner. The fog was not silent in itself, you had learned, though it seemed so at first. It had its own small sounds, the sounds of water settling onto surfaces already wet, a faint, continuous hiss that was too quiet to be heard unless you paid it a particular kind of attention. The hiss was the collective noise of billions of tiny droplets, condensing on the rock walls and the rails and the wooden sleepers, a sound so faint that it lay just at the edge of perception, more a sensation of dampness in the air than an actual noise. If you closed your eyes and concentrated, you could almost hear it, a silvery, sibilant note that hummed without changing pitch, the sound of the fog breathing. Inside the box, the telegraph bell remained mostly silent, but the needle continued its occasional twitching. Each twitch was accompanied by a barely audible click, the sound of the electromagnet engaging and releasing inside the brass case, a sound so small that you heard it only when your head was close to the instrument. The clicks came at random intervals, little papery taps that told of a distant signalman testing his key or a wet branch brushing against a wire miles away. They were not messages, just the background static of the telegraph system, and you let them pass without responding, your mind noting them in the same way it noted the dripping of the water, as events that required no action. The clock continued its steady tick, the pendulum swinging behind its glass door, the minute hand moving forward in tiny, juddering steps that you could see if you watched for long enough. The sound of the clock was a dry, precise tap, different from the wet plink of the water and the metallic click of the telegraph, a sound that belonged to the world of human measurement rather than the world of nature. You found it comforting, this regular marking of time, because it imposed a structure on the long hours, dividing the shift into portions that could be counted and accounted for in the train register. From somewhere out in the fog, possibly from the direction of the tunnel, you heard a new sound, a low, prolonged groan that rose slightly in pitch before fading away. It was the sound of a timber settling, one of the great wooden beams that shored up the tunnel portal, shifting a fraction of an inch under the weight of the hill above it, or perhaps a rail expanding or contracting, with a change in temperature too small to measure. The cutting was never truly silent. It was filled with the small noises of a world in slow motion, the creaking of ancient stresses, the sighing of stone and earth and wood as they adjusted to the endless pressure of gravity. You listened to the groan as it died away, and you thought about the hundreds of tons of rock that hung above the tunnel, the millions of years that had pressed the limestone into its present form, the brief century of human industry that had cut this slot through the hill and laid these rails along its floor. Your own breathing was a sound you became aware of, only when the other sounds paused, a soft, regular rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock in its own way, slower and warmer, a living counterpoint to the mechanical beat. You breathed through your nose, your mouth closed, and the air that passed in and out was cool at the tip of your nose, but warm in your throat, and the sound it made was a gentle, whispering rush that blended with the hiss of the stove and the drip of the water until you could no longer separate one from another. You shifted on the stool, and the wood creaked under you, a brief, sharp sound that seemed loud in the small room. The creak was answered after a moment by a similar creak from somewhere else in the box, a sympathetic response from the floorboards or the wall panel that had been disturbed by your movement. The box was built of pine boards nailed to a frame of thicker timbers, and it had been standing for enough years that every board had learned to speak in its own voice when the temperature changed, or the wind blew, or a man moved inside it. You had come to know these voices. The particular groan of the third step from the top, the little crack that the corner joint made when the stove was at its hottest, and you heard them now as a kind of quiet conversation, the box talking to itself in the fog. Your coat hanging on its peg by the door gave off the faintest rustle as it dried, the woolen fibers relaxing and shifting as the moisture evaporated from them. The rustle was a soft, scratchy sound, like a small animal turning in its sleep, and it came only once, a single brief whisper that you caught and let go. The paraffin lamp on the wall bracket burned with a tiny, almost inaudible hiss, the flame consuming the oil at a steady rate, and the sound of it was a high, thin note that you could hear only when the stove was quiet and the clock was between ticks. If you held your breath and listened very carefully, you could hear the flame itself, a sound that was more a sensation of light than a true noise, a feathery presence at the top edge of silence. From the direction of the tunnel, the dripping paused for a moment, as it sometimes did when a change in air pressure moved through the cutting. The silence that followed was sudden and complete. A brief vacuum of sound had lasted perhaps 10 seconds before the first drop fell again, heavier and louder than before, as if the pause had allowed more water to gather. You waited, and the dripping resumed its regular rhythm, the plinks spacing themselves out into their familiar pattern. The interruption had been nothing, just a minor shift in the fog's density or a faint current of air moving through the tunnel from the other side of the hill. But it had broken the flow of the background noise and made you aware for a moment of how much you depended on that constant, gentle sound. The telegraph bell rang a single note, the call attention signal from the Chippenham box, and you reached up without hurry and pressed the key once in reply. A moment later the bell rang again, a slow, irregular pattern that you recognized not as a standard train code, but as a few words tapped out in the informal language that signalmen used among themselves on quiet nights. The pattern was a series of beats and pauses that meant approximately, "Fog very thick here, how is it with you?" And you smiled slightly without moving your face, because it was a small human touch in the long darkness, a reminder that another man was sitting somewhere in a similar box, looking out at the same grey blankness. You tapped back a brief reply, the rhythm of the beat saying, "The same, no change," and then the bell fell silent again, the conversation complete. You returned your attention to the window, where the fog still pressed against the glass like a soft grey hand. The red and green lamps were still visible, their colours muted and spread out into hazy discs that seemed to be part of the fog itself rather than distinct lights. The moisture on the outside of the glass had beaded into tiny droplets that caught the lantern light and sparkled with a faint golden glimmer, a quiet prettiness that you noticed and then forgot. Beyond the glass, there was no movement, no change, only the patient, endless grey. The bird called again, a single keywick that was closer this time, perhaps from the edge of the cutting rather than the top, and you wondered if it had flown down to investigate the strange glow of the signal lamps, or if the fog had simply bent its voice into a nearer shape. The call hung in the air for a moment, a small sharp point of sound, and then it was gone, and the silence that followed was deeper than before, as if the fog had absorbed the call and wrapped it in layers of damp grey wool. You listened for a response that did not come, and then you let the silence settle over you, a silence made of many small sounds that together formed a kind of quiet music, the music of the cutting at night. The clock ticked. The stove breathed. The water dripped. The water dripped. The needle clicked. The lamp hissed. Your coat rustled once, a single soft note, and then was still. You sat in the middle of all these sounds, not thinking, not waiting, just being, a quiet presence in the small wooden box at the bottom of the limestone cutting. The night was still young, the mail train still somewhere to the west, and the fog held everything in its damp, gentle embrace, muffling the world into a small circle of warmth and light and steady, patient sound. You closed your eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen more deeply, and the sounds of the cutting rose up around you like water rising in a pool, slow and calm and without end. The telegraph bell had run the code for the down mail train entering the section. 3 beats, a pause, and a single beat, and you had risen from the stool before the last note had finished sounding. The needle in the block indicator now pointed to the right, the word train online visible through the small glass window, and the brass case seemed to hold a new alertness, as if the instrument itself knew that something was approaching. You wiped the window pane with the flat of your hand, clearing a smear of condensation so that you could see the track, though there was little to see yet beyond the fog and the soft blur of the signal lamps. Then you turned to the lever frame, the row of tall iron handles that stood in the center of the box, and you let your hand rest on the first lever you would need, feeling the cool painted metal under your palm. The levers were arranged in a logical order, the sequence that the railway company's engineers had designed so that a signalman's hands could move from one to the next in a smooth, natural progression. Each lever was numbered, the brass plate at its base engraved with a figure and a brief description, and you knew everyone by touch as well as by sight. The first lever in the frame controlled the distant signal, the tall post that stood some hundreds of yards down the line towards Bath, its arm visible to a driver long before he reached the home signal. The lever was painted a faded green, the color that the company used for signals that gave permission, and it stood upright in its quadrant, locked in the position that held the distant arm at caution. You placed your hand on the curved iron handle, feeling the slight roughness of the paint where it had worn thin over years of use, and you pulled the lever towards you with one smooth, heavy motion. The lever moved through its arc with a steady resistance, the rods and wires outside the box transmitting the pull along the trackbed to the distant signal post, where a counterweight would be rising and the green spectacle plate would be swinging into place. You felt the catch engage at the end of the stroke, a solid thunk that travelled up through the iron into your hand, and you knew that a mile away or more, the distant signal was now showing a green light, telling the driver of the mail train that the line was clear and he could proceed. You released your grip and let your hand fall to the next lever, the one that controlled the home signal close to the box, and you paused there for a moment, because the sequence required that the home signal remain at danger until the train was nearly upon you, a precaution that prevented any driver from overshooting the box. You looked through the window again, scanning the grey blankness for any change, any hint of light or movement. The fog remained as dense as ever, a wall of soft grey that seemed to absorb the glow of your own signal lamps without reflecting anything back. But even as you watched, you became aware of a new sensation that was entering your feet through the soles of your boots. The floorboards of the box, the pine planks laid over the joists that rested on the brick foundation, were carrying a vibration, a low, deep hum that was not yet a sound but a tremor, a faint thrumming that rose through the wood and into your body. You stood very still, your weight evenly balanced, and you let the vibration come to you, feeling it grow in intensity with each passing second, a steady, rhythmic pulse that had not been there before, and that could mean only one thing. The mail train was approaching, its heavy locomotive pressing down on the rails and sending its message ahead through the iron and the stone. The vibration deepened, becoming a definite sensation that you could feel in your legs and in the hand that still rested on the lever. It was a compound rhythm, a series of separate beats that overlapped and merged, the spinning of the driving wheels, the thrust of the pistons, the rolling weight of the carriages behind. You had felt this same vibration hundreds of times on hundreds of nights, and it never changed in its essential character, though it varied in strength depending on the speed of the train and the dampness of the ground. Tonight, the vibration was muffled by the saturated ballast and the heavy air, so that it reached you as a low, blurred throb rather than a sharp hammering, a soundless noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You turned from the window and moved to the small desk, taking up the pen and noting the time of the approach in the train register, the nibs scratching out the figures in the dim lantern light. Then you returned to the lever frame and placed your hand on the home signal lever, the one with the faded red paint, and you waited. From far down the line, still invisible in the fog, came the first true sound of the train, a long, low whistle that was more a vibration of the air than a clear note. The whistle sounded again, a single prolonged call that rose a little in pitch before falling away, and you knew from its quality that the driver had sighted your distant signal, the green light that you had given him, and was acknowledging it in the traditional way, a salute from one railwayman to another across the miles of foggy darkness. The sound hung in the wet air for a long moment, spreading out and softening, before the fog swallowed it and the cutting was silent once more, except for the growing hum beneath your feet. The glow came next. At first it was not a light so much as a lightening of the fog itself, a supple shift in the greyness that you noticed only because you had been staring into it for so long. The area of fog directly above the track began to pale, turning from a deep charcoal grey to a softer, milkier tone, as if the mist were thinning from within. Then, at the centre of this pale region, a single point of yellow appeared, a tiny speck of brightness that pulsed and flickered and grew steadily larger. It was the headlamp of the locomotive, and you watched it develop from a distant smudge into a distinct disk of light, a glowing circle that pushed back the fog in a small radius around itself. The light was warm and golden, the colour of oil flame shining through a Fresnel lens, and it cast long shifting shadows in the swirling mist, shadows that moved and danced without any solid object to create them. The sound of the engine was now a definite presence, a deep, rhythmic chuffing that echoed between the rock walls of the cutting. Each chuff was a sharp exhalation of steam, followed by a softer intake, and the rhythm was rapid, the driver working the engine hard up the slight grade that led towards the tunnel. You could hear other sounds now too, the hiss of steam escaping from valves, the clanking of coupling rods, the grinding of flanges against the curves of the rails. The whole complex noise of the locomotive poured into the cutting and filled it from wall to wall, a tremendous sound that was somehow not loud but deep, a sound felt in the chest and the throat. The vibration in the floorboards had become a continuous trembling, the teacup rattling softly against its hook, the clock's pendulum swinging with a barely perceptible wobble. You waited until the headlamp had grown to a brilliant glare that lit up the entire width of the cutting, the fog now a swirling mass of white and gold in front of the box. Then, with a final glance at the track to confirm the train's position, you pulled the home signal lever towards you, setting it to clear and allowing the driver to proceed past the box. The lever moved with its familiar heavy smoothness, and you felt the distant clunk of the signal arm dropping to the clear position, the red spectacle plate swinging out of sight and the green below it taking its place. The headlamp seemed to respond, the beam swinging slightly as the driver acknowledged the signal with a brief toot of the whistle, a short, sharp note that was almost lost in the general roar. The locomotive came out of the fog, not suddenly but gradually, its form materializing from the swirling mist like a solid shape condensing from vapor. The buffer beam appeared first, a heavy transverse timber painted dark red and fitted with the two circular buffers that gleamed faintly with oil. Above it the smokebox door came into view, a great round plate of iron secured with dogs around its circumference, the metal dark with heat and streaked with the residue of a long journey. Then the chimney, a tall tapered casting that belched a continuous plume of steam and smoke, the two mingling together in a grey-white column that rose into the fog and merged with it, so that there was no clear boundary between what the engine produced and what the night already held. The locomotive was a 240 tender engine, a common type on the Great Western Railway, its driving wheels 6 feet in diameter, and its outside frames a dark Indian red, picked out with gold lining that glinted momentarily as the headlamp beam caught them. The cab passed your window at the height of your chest, the driver and fireman visible inside as two dark shapes moving against the orange glow of the firebox. The driver had his hand on the regulator, his face half lit by the gauge lamps, his eyes fixed ahead on the track that he could barely see. The fireman was turning away from the open firebox door, his silhouette outlined by a brief flare of white-hot light that threw a rectangular patch of brilliance onto the fog before the door swung shut again. They were both anonymous, just two men doing their work in the middle of the night, and they passed in a rush of hot air and the smell of coal smoke and hot oil and steam. A smell that filled the signal box through the open window crack and lingered there, sharp and warm, after the engine had gone by. The carriages followed, a long string of linked vehicles that rolled past the window one after another with a steady, unhurried rhythm. They were of the broad gauge type, wider than standard carriages and riding on six-wheeled underframes that gave them a smooth, swaying motion. Each carriage had a row of windows, and most of those windows were lit dimly from within by oil lamps mounted on the compartment walls. The lamps were turned down low for the night, their flames reduced to small, steady glows that cast a warm yellow light onto the upholstered seats and the wood-paneled walls. Through the windows you caught glimpses of the passengers, the people who were travelling through the night towards Bath or Bristol or beyond. Some compartments were empty, the seats bare and the blinds half drawn. In others, a single passenger sat in a corner wrapped in a travelling rug, their head propped against a cushion or a rolled coat, their eyes closed in sleep. You saw a man with a grey beard and a soft hat pulled down over his face, his hands folded across his chest, his mouth slightly open. In another compartment, a woman in a dark bonnet was reading by the light of a small book lamp, her face calm and concentrated, her lips moving slightly as she followed the words. A child lay stretched across a seat, covered by a blanket that rose and fell with slow, deep breaths, a small hand hanging over the edge of the cushion. These sleeping passengers, these strangers whose names you would never know, passed before your eyes in a series of quiet vignettes, each compartment a small stage lit by a single lamp, each a brief glimpse of a life travelling through the night. The carriages swayed gently on their springs, the side links clinking, the axle bearings humming a low, continuous note. The wheels clicked over the rail joints in a rhythm that was slower than the engine's beat, a more leisurely, rolling sound that seemed to speak of distance and time. You counted the carriages automatically, a habit from your training, though you knew the down mails consist well enough. A luggage van, a sorting carriage, where postal workers would be standing at the sorting frames, a first-class carriage, two composite carriages, and finally a guard's van with its raised lookout and its side lamp glowing red. The sorting carriage had brighter lights than the others. The postal clerks, still at work behind the steamed-up windows, their shapes moving back and forth as they sorted letters into pigeonholes. Letters that would be delivered in the morning to addresses all along the line. The guard's van at the end of the train had a window on the side, and you saw the guard sitting inside, his cap visible above the half door, his arm resting on a folded flag. He looked out into the fog as he passed, and for a second his face was turned towards your box, though you knew he could not see you through the dark and the mist. The tail lamp of the train was the last thing to pass, a single red point of light that glided by the window and then began to shrink, moving into the fog towards the tunnel mouth. The red grew smaller and dimmer, becoming a tiny spark, and then it was gone, swallowed by the grey, as if the train had never been there at all. The sound of the train receded with it, the chuffing and the clanking fading into a distant rumble, a whisper, and then silence. The deep, damp silence of the cutting settling back into place, like water closing over a stone. You stood at the window for a moment longer, watching the place where the red light had disappeared, and then you turned back to the lever frame. You pulled the home signal lever back to its original position, setting the arm to danger once more, the counterweight dropping with a solid thud that you felt through the floor. Then you pulled the distant signal lever, restoring the caution aspect, the green spectacle plate swinging back behind its red cover. The levers were now as they had been before the train arrived, all standing upright, all showing danger. The railway closed again until the next train was signalled. You walked to the telegraph instrument and placed your fingers on the key. The bell code for "train out of section" was 2 beats, a pause, and then 2 beats again, a simple balance rhythm that told the signalman at Chippenham that the mail train had passed your box and was now in his section. You tapped the code with a steady hand, the key clicking under your thumb, and after a moment the reply came back. The same rhythm repeated, confirming that the train had been noted and accepted. You reached up to the block indicator and turned the small brass switch that sent the needle back to the vertical line-blocked position, a manual action that completed the electrical circuit and informed the box at Bath that the section was once again closed. You sat down on the stool and opened the train register. The pen was still wet from your earlier entry, and you dipped it again before writing, in your slow, careful script. Down mail train, passed at 9:47 p.m, on time, all signals correct. You blotted the ink, closed the ledger, and set the pen back in its groove. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands now showing a few minutes before 10. The stove glowed a dull red through its small mica window, and the kettle on its top was sending up a thin curl of steam that condensed on the wooden ceiling above. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, as thick and featureless as before, and the red and green signal lamps burned with their steady, patient glow. The train was gone, swallowed by the tunnel and the miles of dark track beyond, but its passing had left a small residue of warmth in the air of the box, the lingering smell of coal smoke and steam and hot metal that mixed with the usual scents of paraffin and old wood. You poured a fresh cup of tea, and this time the tea was still hot enough to warm the cup properly, the heat seeping into your palms as you wrapped your hands around it. You drank slowly, your eyes on the instruments, your body settling back into the stillness of the long night. The cutting was quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, a quiet that held the memory of sound, the echo of the trains passing still reverberating faintly in the rock walls and in your own mind. You let the echo fade, and you waited, the hours stretching ahead of you like the rails stretching into the fog, long and straight and patient. The next train was due in the early hours of the morning, and until then there was only the clock, the stove, the dripping water, and the steady, silent hum of the telegraph wires carrying their unseen messages through the night. The locomotive was upon you now, its great dark shape filling the window frame and blocking out even the faint blow of the fog, so that for a moment the small signal box was cast into a deeper shadow. The sound of the engine, which had been building for so long, arrived at its fullest presence, a tremendous composite noise made of many separate parts that had merged into one continuous roar. You could hear the sharp, rhythmic bark of the exhaust as the steam blasted upwards through the chimney, a beat that came faster now as the driver adjusted the cutoff to maintain speed up the gradient. The hiss of live steam escaping from the glands and safety valves was a constant high-pitched undernote, a silvery rushing sound that never paused. Beneath that, the heavy metallic clank of the coupling rods and the deeper grinding of the wheel flanges against the curved rails added a mechanical bass, a sound you felt in the wooden floor and in the iron lever frame, and in the tin cup that still trembled faintly on its hook. The locomotive passed the windows slowly, it seemed, though in truth it was travelling at perhaps 30 miles an hour, a speed that was sufficient to blur the details, but slow enough that a watchful eye could take in each part of the engine as it went by. The buffer beam passed first, the red-painted timber scarred from countless couplings, the two circular buffers gleaming with black grease that had not been entirely wiped away. Then the great cylinders came into view, set low on the outside frames. Their casings painted a dark green that was almost black in the dim light, streaked with condensation from the cold night air. A thin wisp of steam curled from the stuffing box where the piston rod emerged, a sign that the gland packing was wearing but still holding. The piston rod itself was a bright bar of polished steel that slid in and out with a hypnotic rhythm, each stroke accompanied by a puff of steam from the drain cocks that opened automatically at the end of each cycle. You watched the rod for a few cycles, your eye caught by the way the fog light reflected off its oiled surface, a moving band of silver in the darkness. The driving wheel came next, a great disc of iron with a steel tire that rolled past the window at the level of your waist. The wheel was 6 feet in diameter, its spokes elegantly curved, its hub a massive casting that rotated with a heavy, purposeful momentum. The tire made a low, humming sound as it rolled, a musical note that varied slightly with the speed and the condition of the rail, and you could see the fine pattern of wear on its surface, the microflats that had been polished by thousands of miles of contact with the track. The coupling rod that connected this wheel to the next was a thick bar of iron, its ends fitted with brass bearings that gleamed with fresh oil, and it moved in a swift oval path, up and down, forward and back, with an energy that seemed almost animal, a relentless living motion. The whole assembly was a study in controlled power, and you had seen it so many times that you no longer thought about it consciously. It was simply part of the passing, a familiar sequence of shapes and sounds that your mind registered and let go. The cab of the locomotive, when it arrived at the window, was a cave of orange light and moving shadows. The firebox door was open, the fireman having just thrown in a scoop of coal, and the glow that spilled out was intense, a square of white-hot brilliance that illuminated the cab interior and threw the driver's face into sharp relief. You saw the driver clearly for the first time, a man of middle years with a short beard and deep lines around his eyes, his cap pulled low over his forehead, his leather vest dark with coal dust. He was leaning slightly out of the cab window on his side, his hand resting on the regulator handle, his eyes fixed ahead on the track that vanished into the fog beyond the tunnel mouth. He did not look towards the signal box. He had already seen your signals and acknowledged them, and his attention was now entirely on the road ahead, on the invisible rails and the darkness and the responsibility that lay in his hands. His face was calm, concentrated, the face of a man doing a familiar job in difficult conditions, and then he was gone, the cab sliding past and the tender taking its place. The tender was a high-sided vehicle coupled directly behind the locomotive, carrying several tons of coal and a large tank of water. The coal was heaped in a dark pile that rose above the sides, its surface glittering faintly with the light that spilled back from the firebox, the individual lumps of anthracite catching the glow and throwing it back in tiny points. The water in the tank made a sloshing sound, a low, liquid noise that you could hear even over the other sounds, and you caught the smell of the water, a faint metallic tang from the iron tank mixed with the stronger smells of coal dust and hot grease. The tender passed more quickly than the engine, its purpose less dramatic, and then the first of the carriages was rolling by. The carriage passed your window with a soft, swaying motion, its six-wheeled underframe gliding over the rail joints with a series of gentle bumps that were more felt than heard. The body of the carriage was painted in the chocolate and cream livery of the Great Western Railway, though the colours were almost impossible to distinguish in the darkness, appearing only as a deep brown and a pale grey that shifted subtly in the headlamp's reflected glow. The side of the carriage was a series of windows, each one a small rectangle of warm yellow light that passed before your eyes like the frames of a slow-moving picture show. The glass was slightly steamed on the inside from the breath of the passengers, and this gave the light a soft, diffuse quality, a golden haze that seemed to emanate from the carriage itself rather than from any particular lamp. In the first compartment, the one nearest the locomotive, a family was travelling together. The compartment held 4 passengers bunched into the seats, their shapes softened by blankets and overcoats. A woman leaned against the window, her head wrapped in a woolen shawl, her face turned away from the glass so that all you could see was the curve of her shoulder and the pale shape of her hand resting on the window ledge. Beside her, a man in a dark coat was slumped in the corner, his mouth open, his breathing deep and slow, his hat tilted forward over his brow. 2 children lay across the seats, their small bodies curled into each other like puppies. A single travelling rug pulled over both of them. The rug rose and fell with their breathing, the wool a deep grey in the faint light, and you caught a glimpse of a small boot that had fallen from one child's foot and lay on the floor of the compartment, forgotten. The whole scene was one of deep, trusting sleep, the family surrendering themselves to the rhythm of the train and the long night journey, and it passed in a few heartbeats, replaced by the next compartment and the next set of lives. The second compartment was empty, its seats bare, its blinds half drawn. A folded newspaper had been left on one of the cushions, its pages rustling slightly in the draught from the window vent. You could see the headline, a blur of black letters that you could not read, and then the compartment was gone, sliding away into the fog as the train continued its steady progress. The postal carriage came next, and it was different from all the others. This carriage had larger windows, or rather a row of square openings that were not glazed but fitted with sliding shutters, and most of those shutters were up, letting out a brighter, harder light than the passenger compartments. Inside, you could see the sorting frames, tall wooden structures with rows of pigeonholes labelled with the names of towns and cities. The postal workers, men in shirt sleeves with green eye shades pushed up on their foreheads, were moving back and forth along the frames, their hands busy with bundles of letters. The work did not stop for the fog or the hour. The mail had to be sorted before the train reached Bath, and the bags were thrown off at the station. You watched a man reach into a sack and pull out a handful of letters, his fingers sorting them with a rapid automatic motion, slipping each one into its correct pigeonhole without looking. Another man was tying a bundle with string, his movements slowed by the swaying of the carriage, his body bracing itself against the sorting frame. The light in the postal carriage was from oil lamps with broad reflectors, and he cast a brilliant white glow that hurt your eyes after the dimness of the passenger compartments. The postal workers did not look out at the fog. They were absorbed in their task, their world reduced to the letters and the frames and the rhythm of the wheels beneath them. A composite carriage followed, half first class and half second class, the division marked by a partition with a door. The first-class compartments had deeper cushions and more space between the seats, and the passengers inside were travelling with an air of quiet comfort, their coats of better cloth, their blankets thicker. An older man sat alone in one of these compartments, a small book open on his knee. A reading lamp clipped to the wall beside him, casting a circle of light on the page. He was not reading, however. His eyes were closed, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, the book slipping sideways from his grasp. He wondered what he had been reading and whether he would wake when the train reached Bath, or whether he would sleep through his station and wake in Bristol with a start and a muttered apology. The thought passed through your mind without weight, and then the composite carriage was gone and the next was arriving. A second-class compartment, fuller than the first-class ones, held a group of travellers who seemed to know each other, perhaps a family or a party returning from a journey. They were all awake, their faces lit by a single lamp that swung gently from the ceiling. A young woman was talking, her hands moving in gestures you could not interpret through the steamed glass, and the others were listening, their heads nodding gently. There was no sound from them that you could hear over the noise of the train, just the silent pantomime of conversation, the opening and closing of mouths, the leaning in to speak, the leaning back to listen. You saw a man laugh, his face breaking into a wide smile, his shoulders shaking, and then the whole compartment slid past and was replaced by the dark space between the carriages, a brief interval of clanking and the smell of coal dust, and then the next carriage beginning. The guard's van was at the very end of the train, and it was the last vehicle to pass your window. The van was shorter than the passenger carriages, with a raised lookout on the roof that gave the guard a view forward over the train. The side of the van had a half-door, and the guard was standing there with his elbow resting on the ledge, looking out into the fog. He was a stout man in a heavy coat, a red scarf wrapped around his neck, his guard's cap set squarely on his head. In his hand he held a red flag, rolled up and ready, and beside him on the floor of the van you could see a lamp and a box of detonators, the tools of his trade. The guard's face was calm, his eyes scanning the track behind the train, though there was nothing to see but the swirling grey. He was the last man on the train, the one responsible for ensuring that the train was complete and that no mishap went unnoticed. And he performed his duty with the same quiet attention that you performed yours, the long habit of the railway binding you together, even though you had never met. The guard looked towards your box as he passed, and you raised a hand in a small wave of acknowledgement, though you knew he could not see you. It was a reflex, a gesture of solidarity from one railwayman to another, and then the guard's van was passed and the tail lamp was all that remained. The tail lamp glowed at the very end of the train, a single red light that was the last thing a signalman saw before the section was cleared. It was a small steady flame burning inside a red glass housing, and the housing was mounted on the rear of the guard's van, secured with a bracket that held it firm against the swaying and the jolting of the track. The red light was a bright clear colour, not the blurred smudge of the signal lamps in the fog, but a sharp, distinct point of colour that you could watch for a long time as it moved away. And you did watch it, watching the red light grow smaller and smaller, its brilliance diminishing to a spark, and then the spark itself was absorbed by the fog, and there was nothing left of the train at all. The sound faded more slowly than the light. The rumble of the wheels continued to echo between the cutting walls for many moments after the train had vanished, the noise bouncing back and forth, growing softer and more distant, until it was only a whisper, a memory of a train that you could no longer hear, but could still imagine. The vibration in the floorboards diminished gradually. the teacup ceasing its faint rattle, the clock's pendulum steadying, until the box was completely still again. The smell of the train lingered longest, the sharp odor of coal smoke hanging in the damp air, mixed with the scent of hot metal cooling and the faint breath of oil and steam that had seeped in through the window crack. You left the window open a little longer, letting the smell dissipate slowly, letting the outside air return to its usual state of cold, wet neutrality. When the last echo had died away, you turned from the window and walked the 2 steps to the lever frame. The levers stood as you had left them, their handles upright in the quadrant. You placed your hand on the home signal lever, the one with the faded red paint, and you pulled it back from the clear position to danger, the action heavy and deliberate, the counterweight dropping into its stop with a solid thunk that traveled up the iron and into your arm. Then you reached for the distant signal lever, the green one further along the row, and you restored that to caution, feeling the distant resistance of the arm swinging back into place. The levers were now all at rest, the signals all showing their most restrictive aspects, the line shut behind the train as if a door had been closed and bolted. You crossed to the telegraph instrument and placed your thumb and forefinger on the wooden knob of the key. The bell code for "train out of section" was a rhythm as familiar as your own heartbeat. 2 beats, a pause, 2 beats. You tapped it out, the key clicking cleanly with each press, the sound small and bright in the quiet box. Then you waited, your eyes on the block indicator, and after a moment the needle twitched and the reply came back, the same 2 and 2 rhythm echoed by the signalman at Chippenham, telling you that the mail train had been noticed and accepted into his section. You reached up and turned the small brass knob on the indicator, and the needle swung from "train on line" back to "line blocked," a smooth, silent arc that restored the instrument to its waiting state. The train register lay open on the desk, and you sat down and took up the pen. The nib was still moist, and you dipped it once in the inkwell before writing the entry. You wrote the train number, the time, and the words "passed on time," all signals correct, fog unchanged, the letters forming slowly under your hand. The ink was a deep blue-black that gleamed wetly for a moment before you blotted it with the pink blotting paper, pressing the paper down with a flat palm and then lifting it to reveal the entry, dry and permanent. You closed the register and placed it back on the shelf, its edges aligned with the desk, its marbled cover cool under your fingertips. The signal box was now utterly quiet, quieter than it had been before the train arrived, as if the passing had drawn all the sound out of the world and left a deeper silence behind. The clock ticked, the stove clicked, the water dripped somewhere out in the cutting, and these sounds seemed separate and distinct in a way they had not been earlier, each one a small island of noise in a great ocean of stillness. You poured a cup of tea from the flask on the stove, the liquid steaming gently in the cool air, and you wrapped your hands around the tin cup, feeling the warmth seep into your palms and fingers. The fog outside the window was as thick as ever, the red and green signal lamps still visible as soft blurred circles that seemed to hang in the grey, without any visible support. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt slightly different, the way a room feels different after a visitor has left, still holding the echo of a presence that is no longer there. You settled onto the stool, your body finding the familiar, worn hollows in the wood, and you let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the clock. The night mail was gone, rushing on towards Bath and Bristol and the far western terminus, but its passing had been the central event of your shift, and now that it was over, the hours ahead stretched out with a new kind of emptiness. You were not lonely. You were not bored. You were simply a man in a signal box, waiting for the next thing that would happen. And in the meantime, there was only the quiet and the fog and the long, slow minutes of the November night. You sat, and you waited, and the cutting was silent around you, and the silence was a soft, heavy thing that wrapped itself around the box and held it, gently, in the deep, patient dark. The last echo of the train faded into the fog with a slow, gentle diminishing, the deep rumble of the wheels becoming a distant murmur that lingered for a time in the rock walls of the cutting, before dissolving entirely into the damp November air. You stood by the window for a long moment after the tail lamp had vanished, your hand still resting on the wooden frame, your eyes still fixed on the place where the red point of light had been swallowed by the grey. The silence that followed the train's departure was a different kind of silence from the one that had come before, not the patient, expectant quiet of waiting, but a deeper, more settled stillness, as if the cutting had been satisfied by the passing and had closed itself up again more completely than before. The fog, which had seemed to thin slightly during the approach and passage of the mail train, now returned with a greater density, its banks rolling in from the direction of the tunnel and pressing against the window panes like a soft, damp hand that had been momentarily lifted and then replaced. The steam and smoke left behind by the locomotive had been quickly absorbed by the fog, the grey swallowing the grey, so that within moments there was no trace of the train's presence in the air. Even the smell of coal smoke and hot oil that had filled the signal box began to fade, drawn out through the narrow gap of the window and replaced by the clean, neutral scent of water-saturated rock that was the default smell of the cutting in November. The vibration that had trembled through the floorboards was entirely gone, the wood now perfectly still under your boots, the teacup hanging motionless on its hook, the clock's pendulum swinging with its usual smooth, uninterrupted rhythm. You turned from the window and looked at the small room around you, the familiar shapes of the stove and the desk and the lever frame, and they seemed settled in a new way, as if they too had relaxed after the brief excitement of the passing. You crossed to the desk and sat down on the wooden stool, the worn seat accepting your weight with a soft creak that was the loudest sound in the box. The train register lay where you had left it, its marbled cover reflecting the lantern light in a faint sheen, and you pulled it towards you with the care you always used when handling the official books. You opened it to the current page, smoothing the paper flat with the side of your hand, and you read over the entries you had made so far during the shift. The first entry, in your own handwriting, recorded your assumption of duty at 5:45 p.m., the fog already noted. The second entry confirmed the block signal exchange with the Chippenham box. The third recorded the passing of the down mail train at 9:47 p.m., on time, with all signals correct. Each entry was a small, precise statement of fact, and together they formed a record of the night that was as clear and as limited as the railway company required. You dipped the pen in the inkwell, tapping the nib gently against the glass rim to remove the excess, and then you held it poised above the paper for a moment while you composed your next entry in your mind. The logbook required a note after every train movement, but it was also customary to record any observations about the weather, the signals, or the general state of the line, particularly on a night like this when the fog was the dominant condition. You began to write, the pen moving across the paper with a soft scratching sound, the letters forming one by one under your careful direction. You wrote the time, which was now 10:15 p.m., and then you wrote the words weather unchanged, fog very thick, visibility less than 50 yards, signal lamps burning well, all instruments working correctly, next train not due until 3:40 a.m. The sentences were plain and factual, without embellishment, but they told the whole story of the night as it stood. A quiet man in a quiet box, the world reduced to a few square feet of warmth and light, the long hours are stretching out like the rails that vanished at the grey. You blotted the entry with the pink blotting paper, pressing it down with an even pressure that absorbed the wet ink without smearing it, and then you closed the ledger and set it aside on the shelf where it belonged. The pen you wiped clean with a scrap of rag, the nib coming away bright and free of dried ink, and you placed it back in its wooden groove on the desk. The small ritual of record-keeping was complete, and you let your hands rest in your lap, your shoulders relaxing, your breathing settling into a slower, deeper pattern. The clock on the wall ticked its steady, unhurried tick, the pendulum swinging behind its glass door with the same motion it had maintained since you had wound it at the start of the shift, a motion that had continued without pause through all the quiet hours and the brief passage of the train. You looked out of the window, your gaze passing through the glass and into the fog beyond. The red and green signal lamps were still visible, their colours soft and diffuse, and they seemed to hang in the grey with a gentle permanence, as if they had been there not for a single night, but for all the nights that had ever been. The fog had become so dense that it now had a texture you could almost feel, a thick, velvety presence that filled the cutting from the ballast to the invisible sky above. Nothing moved in the fog. There was no wind to stir it, no distant light to pierce it, no sound to trouble its heavy stillness. The world outside the window was a world in suspension, a painting executed entirely in shades of grey, with only the two small points of red and green to remind you that colour still existed somewhere in the universe. You thought about the passengers who had passed in the mail train, the sleeping family, the man with his book, the postal workers sorting letters in their bright, busy carriage. They were miles away now, perhaps strolling into Bath station or already beyond it, their journey continuing through the night, while you remained here in the cutting, fixed in place like the signal post itself. The thought did not trouble you. It was simply an observation, a quiet acknowledging of the different roles that people played in the great system of the railway. Some travelled, and some stayed still. Some slept, and some kept watch. You were one of the watchers, and you had made your peace with that long ago, accepting the long hours and the solitude as parts of a contract you had signed when you first put on the railway company's uniform. The stove had burned down slightly while you had been occupied with the train, and you rose from the stool to attend to it, moving with the slow, deliberate pace that the night invited. You took the iron scoop from the coal bucket and selected 3 lumps of coal, each one fitting neatly into the palm of your hand, their surfaces glittering with tiny flecks of mineral that caught the lantern light. You opened the small iron door of the stove, the handle warm but not hot through the folded rag you used, and you looked inside at the bed of embers. The coals you had added earlier had burned down to a deep, pulsing orange, their edges crumbling into grey ash, and the fire made a soft, breathing sound as it drew air through the grate. You placed the new lumps carefully on top of the embers, nestling them into the hottest part of the bed, and you watched them for a moment as their undersides began to darken and then to glow, the fire taking hold with small tentative flames that licked around the fresh coal like water around stones. You closed the door gently, the latch clicking into place, and you hung the scoop back on its hook, the metal ringing with a faint musical note. The kettle on the stovetop had been simmering quietly, its water level diminished slightly by evaporation, and you topped it up from the stoneware jug that stood in the corner, the water glugging into the kettle with a series of soft, hollow sounds that were the only human-made noise in the cutting. You set the jug back in its place and took your tin cup from its hook, holding it under the kettle's spout as you tilted the vessel to pour. The water that came out was near boiling, steaming in the cool air, and it sluiced around the cup in a swirl of clear liquid that quickly took on the dark brown color of the tea leaves you had added, a small measure of leaves from a twist of paper that you kept in your waistcoat pocket. You let the tea steep for a time, the steam rising in a thin white curl, and then you wrapped your hands around the warm tin and returned to the stool by the window. The tea was hot and strong, its bitterness cut by the small amount of sugar you had added, and you drank it slowly, the warmth spreading from your mouth down your throat and into your chest. Each sip was a small, simple pleasure, a moment of comfort in the long darkness, and you took your time with it, not rushing because there was nothing to rush for. The next scheduled train was not due for several hours, a slow goods that would pass through the section in the early hours of the morning, and until then, your duty was simply to be here, to watch the instruments, and to wait. Waiting was the largest part of a signalman's job, and you had learned over the years to treat it not as an absence of activity, but as a kind of activity in itself. A quiet, attentive presence that required no movement but did require a certain quality of mind. You set the empty cup aside, and let your eyes rest on the block instrument, where the needle still pointed to the vertical line-blocked position. The telegraph bell was silent, the key motionless, the whole apparatus in a state of rest. Somewhere, miles away, the signalmen in the other boxes were also waiting, their instruments also silent, their windows also fogged, their stoves also blowing with the same steady warmth. The thought of them, these unknown men sitting in their own small cabins along the line, was a quiet comfort, a reminder that you were part of a network of watchers spread out across the dark countryside, each one keeping his section safe, each one linked to the others by the thin copper wires that hummed through the night. You did not need to speak to them. It was enough to know that they were there, that the system was whole, that the line was attended from one end to the other. The silence in the cutting had deepened still further, or perhaps your ears had grown more accustomed to it, so that you could now hear smaller, subtler sounds that had been hidden before. You could hear the very faint rustle of the lantern flame as it burned, a tiny, feathery sound that was almost not a sound at all. You could hear the settling of the coal in the stove, a low internal crinkle as the embers shifted and the fire found new channels for its air. You could hear, if you listened very carefully, the distant, almost imaginary sound of water seeping through the limestone, a slow subterranean trickle that had been going on since long before the railway was built and would go on long after. The cutting was not truly silent, you understood. It was filled with the small noises of a world at rest, and your presence among them was just one more element in the quiet composition. You rose from the stool and stretched your arms slowly, feeling the muscles in your shoulders and back loosen after the long period of sitting. The signal box was small, but there was room enough to stand and move a few paces, and you walked slowly around the interior, your boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. You checked the window latch, which was secure. You checked the door, which was closed tight against the fog. You checked the lever frame, laying your hand on each lever in turn, feeling the cool iron and the slight give of the mechanism as you tested the catch. Everything was as it should be, and the small tour of inspection was completed in less than a minute, leaving you once again by the window, looking out at the fog. The fog had a hypnotic quality when you stared into it for long enough, a soft, featureless grey that seemed to move without moving, its slow swirls and drifts visible only if you fixed your attention on one spot and waited. You watched the fog for a time, letting your mind go slack, not thinking of anything in particular, just observing the gentle flow of the mist as it passed across the window. The red and green lamps were constant companions in this watching, their colours a steady anchor in the shifting grey, and you found yourself glancing at them periodically, checking that they were still burning, even though you knew they were. The act of checking was a habit ingrained so deeply that it had become automatic, a small repetitive ritual that you performed without conscious thought, and it was one of the many small rituals that made up the fabric of the shift. The clock struck the hour with a single soft chime, a mechanism you rarely heard because the clock was not designed to chime fully, only to mark the hour with a brief, restrained note that was just loud enough to be noticed. You looked up at the clock face and saw that it was 11 o'clock, the hands forming a precise right angle, the Roman numerals clear and black against the cream-colored dial. The shift was now 5 hours old, which meant that you had perhaps 7 more hours ahead of you before the day signalman arrived, stamping his feet and blowing on his hands, and you would walk back up the steep path to the cottage. 7 hours was a long stretch of time, but you did not measure it in hours so much as in the small events that would punctuate it. The telegraph signals, the passing of trains, the gradual lightening of the fog towards dawn. You resumed your seat on the stool, your body finding the familiar position with the ease of long habit, and you folded your hands in your lap, the fingers interlacing loosely, the warmth of the stove pressed against your side, a gentle, even heat that wrapped around you like a blanket, and the tea you had drunk left a small, warm core in your stomach that added to the general feeling of comfort. Outside, the fog continued its slow, silent drifting, and the signal lamps continued their steady burning, and the rails continued their patient waiting for the next train. The cutting was a place out of time, a deep stone chamber where the normal rules of day and night were suspended, and you were its temporary custodian, a quiet figure in a quiet box watching over the railway while the rest of the world slept. The dripping of water continued at a steady, irregular rhythm, each drop falling with a soft plink onto the wet ballast. The sound so familiar that it had become part of the silence itself. The drip was a kind of clock, a natural timekeeper that measured the night not in minutes and hours, but in the slow, patient release of moisture from the limestone rock. You listened to it for a while, letting the drops mark out their random pattern, and you thought about the water that was seeping through the hill above the tunnel, water that had fallen as rain, perhaps days or weeks or even years ago, making its slow way through the cracks and fissures of the stone until it emerged here, in the cutting, to fall with a quiet plink onto the gravel and begin its journey towards the river and the sea. The thought was a peaceful one, a reminder of the long, slow processes that went on beneath the surface of things, and it settled into your mind without disturbance, like a stone dropping into a still pool. The fog outside the window seemed to pulse very slightly with the beating of your own heart, a trick of the eyes that you had noticed before on nights like this, when the grey was so uniform and so constant that your own body began to project rhythms onto it. You blinked, and the pulsing stopped, and the fog was once again a blank, motionless wall. You closed your eyes for a moment, not because you were sleepy, but because you wanted to rest your vision, to let the muscles around your eyes relax after so many hours of watching. The darkness behind your eyelids was warm and red-tinged from the lantern light, and you sat there in that private darkness, listening to the clock and the stove and the drip of the water, and you felt a deep, quiet peace settle over you. The peace of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he is supposed to do, with nothing to regret and nothing to fear. When you opened your eyes again, the fog was still there, the lamps were still burning, the clock still ticking, and nothing had changed. Nothing would change for several hours yet, and you were content with that, content to sit and wait and watch, content to be a small, still point in the great, moving darkness of the November night. You picked up the tin cup, poured another measure of tea from the kettle, and settled back on the stool, your eyes on the window, your hands warm around the metal, your mind at rest. The silence of the cutting wrapped around the signal box like a soft, heavy blanket, and you let it hold you there, patient and calm, through the long, slow hours before dawn. The hours between the passing of the mail train and the first grey hint of dawn were the longest of the shift, a stretch of time that seemed to expand in the quiet, each minute opening out into a small, still pool that you entered and then left, without any sense of having moved. You had been sitting on the stool for some time, your body still, your mind drifting in the way it often did during these middle hours. Not asleep, but not fully alert either. Suspended in a state of restful attention that was peculiar to the signalman's trade. The clock ticked on, the pendulum swinging, the hands moving around the cream-colored dial in their slow, inevitable progress. The stove glowed a steady, dull red, its warmth filling the small room with an even, dry heat that wrapped around you like a heavy coat. The fog outside the window was unchanged. A blank grey wall that pressed against the glass with the same soft, patient pressure it had maintained since early evening. The telegraph bell rang, and the sound cut through the silence with a clarity that pulled your attention back from wherever it had been wandering. The ring was a single, clear note, the call attention signal, and it came from the west, from the box at Bath, where another signalman was sitting through the same long night. You straightened on the stool, your hand moving to the key with the automatic ease of long practice, and you pressed it once in reply, the single click that meant you were listening. The bell rang again a moment later, but instead of the crisp, formal rhythm of a train code, the beats that came were slower, more irregular, the pattern of a man tapping out a few words in the informal language that signalmen shared among themselves. The rhythm was a series of short and long beats, pauses and clusters, and you listened with your head tilted slightly, decoding the message as it came. The man at Bath was telling you about the fog, how it had grown thicker towards the east, how a slow goods train was being held at his station because the driver could not see the signals well enough to proceed, how the night stretched on with a particular kind of heaviness that made the hours feel longer than usual. The message was not urgent, not official, just the quiet sharing of information between two men who were alone in the dark. You waited until the bell had fallen silent, and then you composed your reply in your mind. A few words tapped out in the same slow, informal rhythm. Your thumb pressed the key down with a series of soft, deliberate clicks, the beat spelling out a response that confirmed the fog was just as thick on your end, the same heavy grey that had been there all evening. The line clear, but visibility down to almost nothing. The mail train having passed on time and without incident. You tapped a brief observation about the dripping of the water in the cutting, how the sound seemed louder tonight, or perhaps it was only the fog that made everything seem closer and more present, and you ended with a simple acknowledgement, a few beats that meant something like, "We are both here, the line is safe, the night will pass." The key fell silent under your thumb, and you released it, letting your hand drop back to your lap. The telegraph bell gave one final soft note, a single beat that was the other man's way of saying, "I have heard you," and then the instrument was quiet. The silence that followed the conversation was a companionable silence, different from the empty quiet that had come before. You knew, without having to think about it, that the man at Bath was settling back on his own stool, checking his own stove, looking out at his own wall of fog. The two of you were connected by the thin copper wire that ran alongside the track, a wire that carried not only the official bell codes and the block signals, but also these small human exchanges that made the long nights bearable. The telegraph was a device for sending information, but it was also a device for sending presence, a way of reaching out across the miles of dark countryside and touching another person with a series of clicks and pauses, a rhythm that said without words, "I am here, you are there, we are both watching." The needle in the block indicator continued its occasional trembling, a series of tiny, silent vibrations that were not messages but the ghosts of messages, the faint electrical impulses that traveled along the wires from boxes further up and down the line. Sometimes the needle would give a single sharp flick and then settle, a movement caused by a signalman at Swindon or Didcot testing his key, or sending a routine code to a box that was not yours. These phantom signals were part of the background of the night, a quiet, rhythmic language that you understood without fully listening, the way a sailor understands the creaking of a ship's timbers or a farmer understands the sounds of his animals at rest. The needle was never entirely still, and its small movements were a reminder that the system was alive, that the current was flowing, that the wires were intact and carrying their invisible traffic through the fog. You rose from the stool after a while and walked to the stove, where you opened the small iron door to check on the fire. The coals you had added earlier had burned down to a bed of orange embers that glowed with a deep, pulsing light, and the new lumps you had placed on top were now well alight, their surfaces covered in a fine grey ash that cracked and fell away as the coal shifted. You took the brass poker and pushed the embers gently, settling them into a more even bed, and the fire responded with a soft flare of brighter orange that lit up the inside of the stove and threw a warm glow onto your face and hands. The heat was a comfort, a steady, reliable presence in the small room, and you stood there for a moment with the door open, letting the warmth wash over you, before closing it again and returning to the window. Outside, the fog had not changed, but your eyes had grown so accustomed to its blank greyness that you could now perceive subtle variations in its texture, areas of greater and lesser density that drifted slowly across the window, like the shadows of clouds moving over a still pond. The red and green signal lamps were constant, their colours diffused into soft circles of light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the dripping of the water or the beating of your own heart. You watched the lamps for a time, checking that they were still burning, even though you had checked them not long before and knew they were. The act of checking was a comfort in itself, a small ritual that gave structure to the long hours. The telegraph bell rang again some time later, though you could not have said exactly how much later, the clock being something you consulted only when you needed to make an entry in the register. This time, the bell rang with the formal rhythm of a train code. 3 beats, a pause, 1 beat, the signal for an up train entering the section from the Chippenham direction. You rose from the stool and moved to the lever frame, your hand finding the distant signal lever as the bell continued its message, and you acknowledged the signal with a single beat on the key before pulling the lever towards you, setting the distant signal to clear. The up train was the slow goods that the signalman at Bath had mentioned, the one that had been held at the station, and you imagined it now labouring up the gradient towards your cutting, its locomotive working hard, its driver peering into the fog for the sight of your green light. The vibration of the train reached you a few minutes later, a low, heavy thrum that was different from the sharper rhythm of the mail train, a slower, more ponderous beat that spoke of a heavier load and a smaller engine. The goods train passed the box with a great clanking and hissing, its wagons loaded with coal and timber and goods in wooden crates that gleamed wetly in the dim light, and you watched it pass with the same calm attention you gave to every train, noting the tail lamp and pulling the levers back to danger, sending the bell code for train out of section, making the entry in the register. When the goods train had gone and the silence had returned, you poured another cup of tea and sat down once more on the stool, your body settling into the familiar position with the ease of long habit. The conversation with the signalman at Bath had reminded you of something that you often forgot during the long hours, which was that you were not truly alone, that the railway was a network of men like yourself, each one sitting in his own small box, each one watching his own section of track, each one connected to the others by the wires that hummed through the night. The thought was a quiet comfort, and it stayed with you as the clock ticked and the stove glowed and the fog pressed against the window, a small, warm presence in the back of your mind. The dripping of the water continued at its steady, irregular rhythm, each drop a clear, musical note that fell onto the wet ballast and then was silent. You listened to the dripping for a while, letting the sound wash over you, and you thought about the water that was seeping through the limestone, the slow, patient movement of moisture through the rock, and how the cutting was a place where water and stone and human industry met in a quiet, ongoing exchange. The thought was a peaceful one, and it carried you forward through the hours, your mind calm and still, your body at rest, your attention fixed on the instruments and the signals and the long, slow passage of the night. The telegraph needle continued its occasional trembling, a series of small, silent movements that were the background noise of the system, and you watched the needle with a kind of fondness, the way you might watch the breathing of a sleeping animal. The needle was a companion of sorts, a link to the wider world that did not demand your attention but was always there, a quiet, rhythmic presence that you understood without having to think. The language of the telegraph was a language of beats and pauses, of rhythms that meant specific things, and you had learned it so thoroughly that it had become a part of you, a second language that you spoke as fluently as English. The clicks and twitches of the needle were the words of that language, and you listened to them now with half an ear, your mind drifting but still attentive, still ready to respond if a call came for you. The clock struck the hour with its single soft chime, and you looked up at the face and saw that it was 2 o'clock in the morning. The night had passed its midpoint, and the hours ahead were now fewer than the hours behind. The thought gave you no particular satisfaction. It was simply a fact, a small piece of information that you noted and then let go. The shift would end when it ended, and until then there was nothing to do but wait and watch, to tend the stove and check the lamps, to listen to the telegraph and the dripping water and the slow, steady ticking of the clock. You stretched your arms slowly, feeling the muscles in your shoulders loosen, and then you folded your hands in your lap and settled back on the stool. The fog outside the window was as thick as ever, but you had stopped noticing it as a separate thing. It had become the background of the night, a soft, grey presence that was as much a part of the cutting as the limestone walls or the iron rails. The red and green lamps burned with their steady, patient glow, and the telegraph needle trembled with its quiet, rhythmic language, and the clock ticked its unhurried tick, and you sat among all these things, a calm, still figure in the small wooden box, waiting for the dawn. The slow goods train had passed into the darkness to the east, its heavy clanking and the low throb of its engine fading by degrees into the fog, and the cutting settled once more into its long, patient stillness. You made the entry in the train register with the same careful script you always used, noting the time as 2:47 a.m., the train's identification, and the fact that it had passed with all signals correct and the fog unchanged. You blotted the ink, closed the ledger, and set the pen back in its groove, the small ritual completing itself without hurry. The clock on the wall now showed a few minutes before 3, and you understood, without needing to calculate, that the deepest part of the night had arrived. The hours when the world above the cutting was at its most silent, when even the owls had fallen quiet, and the villages in the valley lay wrapped in a darkness that would not begin to lift for some time yet. The stove had burned low during the passing of the goods train, and you attended to it now with the slow, methodical movements that the cold hour invited. You opened the small iron door and looked inside at the bed of embers, which had collapsed into a mound of grey ash with only a few orange hearts still glowing at the center. The fire needed rebuilding, not just topping up, and you took the brass poker and stirred the ashes gently, breaking up the clinkers and letting the dead ash fall through the grate into the pan below. A thin cloud of fine grey dust rose from the firebox, catching the lantern light and hanging in the air for a moment before settling, and you turned your face away out of long habit, waiting for the dust to clear before you reached for the coal scoop. You selected 4 lumps of coal this time, larger than the ones you had used earlier, and you placed them carefully onto the revived embers, arranging them so that they formed a small, close-packed mound with channels for the air to flow between them. The embers responded with a faint crackling, and a small blue flame licked up around the edges of the new coal, tentative at first, then strengthening as the heat took hold. You closed the stove door, adjusted the damper to give the fire a little more air, and listened to the deepening roar of the flames as they found their new fuel, a sound that was both fierce and contained, like a small, captive wind. Your tea was nearly finished, only a dark, cool residue remaining in the bottom of the tin cup, and you rinsed the cup with a little hot water from the kettle, swilling it around and tossing the dregs out of the window, crack into the fog. The water made a brief soft patter on the cinders below before the fog absorbed the sound. You took a fresh pinch of tea leaves from the twist of paper in your waistcoat pocket and dropped them into the cup, then filled it with steaming water from the kettle, the dark color blooming upwards through the clear liquid like a slow brown cloud. You carried the cup back to the stool and sat down, your body finding its familiar position with the ease of long practice, and you wrapped your hands around the warm tin, letting the heat seep into your fingers, which had grown cold during the time you had stood at the open stove door. The hours between 3 and 5 in the morning were, in your experience, the longest hours of the shift, the time when the body's rhythms dipped to their lowest point and the mind became susceptible to strange, drifting thoughts. You had learned to accept this period without resisting it, to let the mind wander where it would, while keeping a small, alert part of yourself always aware of the instruments and the silence of the cutting. The trick was not to fight the drowsiness, but to coexist with it, to allow the heavy warmth of the stove and the soft ticking of the clock to wrap around you like a blanket, while your hearing remained tuned to the particular frequencies of the railway, the ring of the telegraph bell, the distant hum of a train, the sudden silence that meant something had changed. You sat for a time in this state of suspended attention, not fully awake and not asleep, your eyes half closed, your breathing slow and regular. The fog outside the window had become a kind of constant, a featureless grey that you no longer saw as a separate thing, but sensed simply as the absence of anything else. The red and green signal lamps were still there, you knew, burning steadily in the murk, and you opened your eyes every few minutes to check that they were, the brief glance confirming their presence before your lids dropped again. The clock ticked, and the stove ticked, and the water dripped somewhere out in the cutting, and these sounds wove together into a quiet tapestry that held you gently in its weave. Some time later, you could not have said exactly when, you became aware of a change in the air of the signal box. It was not a sound or a movement, but a subtle shift in the quality of the warmth, a slight lessening of the dry comfort that the stove had been providing. You opened your eyes fully and looked at the stove. The damper was still correctly set, the fire still burning with a steady, muffled roar, but the heat it gave seemed diminished, as if the cold from outside had grown stronger and was pressing more insistently against the wooden walls. You rose from the stool and walked to the door, and when you put your hand against the wood panel, you felt the cold radiating through it, a deep, penetrating chill that had not been there earlier in the night. The temperature outside had dropped, and the fog had become a cold fog, the kind that seeped into every gap and crack and found its way through the thickest wool and the sturdiest boots. You decided to check the signal lamps again, partly because it was time, partly because the walk out into the cutting would shake off the last of the drowsiness and bring you fully awake for the remaining hours of the shift. You took your coat from the peg and buttoned it up to your chin, the wool cold and slightly damp from the fog that had seeped in through the window crack. You pulled your cap down over your ears and took the lamp box from its shelf, checking that the brass lighter was in your waistcoat pocket, and then you opened the door and stepped out into the cutting. The cold struck you immediately, a damp clinging cold that was different from the dry chill of a clear winter night. The fog was still thick, but it had changed its character. It was now a heavier, wetter presence that clung to your face and hands like a cold, damp cloth, and when you breathed in, you could feel the moisture settling in your throat and lungs. The lamp you carried illuminated only a small circle of wet gravel immediately around your feet, and beyond that circle the fog was a solid wall of grey that gave no hint of the cutting walls or the signal post or the mouth of the tunnel. You walked slowly towards the ladder, your boots crunching on the cinders with the same muffled sound they had made all night, and you felt the cold creeping up through the soles of your boots into your feet, a slow, insistent chill that reminded you that the world outside the signal box was not yet ready to give up its winter hold. You climbed the ladder carefully, the iron rungs even colder and wetter than they had been earlier, and you held the rail with one hand while you carried the lamp box in the other. The platform at the top of the post was coated in a fine film of moisture that had not frozen but was cold enough to sting your fingers when you touched it. The signal lamps were burning still, their red and green glow steady and clear, and you were relieved to see that they had not been affected by the increased dampness. You opened each lamp in turn and checked the wicks and the paraffin levels, trimming the wicks slightly where they had begun to mushroom, topping up the reservoirs with the small tin of paraffin you carried. The work was slow and careful, your fingers moving with the deliberate precision of a man who knows that a mistake made in the cold and dark could have consequences that would last long after the fog had lifted. When both lamps were clean and full and burning evenly, you closed them up, wiped the outside of the glass with a dry rag to remove the beads of moisture that had condensed there, and hung them back on their brackets. You stood on the platform for a moment, your hands resting on the cold, wet railing, and you looked out into the fog that surrounded you. There was nothing to see but the soft grey glow of the lamps themselves, their colours diffused into the mist so that they seemed to fill the entire world. The silence up here was different from the silence in the signal box, larger and more open, though the fog made it feel enclosed, as if you were standing at the bottom of a deep well filled with grey wool. You breathed the cold air slowly, feeling it fill your lungs, and then leave them in a cloud of white vapour that joined the fog and disappeared. The cutting below you was invisible, the box was invisible, and for a long moment you were suspended in a grey void, alone with the two coloured lights and the sound of your own breathing. The sensation was not frightening, it was simply strange, a small departure from the familiar world, and you accepted it as you accepted all the other small strangenesses of the night shift. You climbed back down the ladder, your boots finding each rung with the automatic memory of many repetitions, and you walked the short distance to the tunnel mouth. The entrance to Box Tunnel was a great black arch that you could not see until you were almost upon it, its shape emerging from the fog as a deeper darkness within the general grey. The air near the tunnel was colder and damper than the air in the rest of the cutting, and it carried a smell of wet stone and old smoke and the faint mineral tang of the limestone that had been cut through when the tunnel was built 30 years before. You stood at the portal and looked into the blackness, which was so complete that it seemed to absorb the light from your lamp and give nothing back. From deep inside the tunnel, from somewhere far within the hill, you could hear the slow, steady drip of water falling from the roof onto the track, a sound that was magnified and echoed by the tunnel's shape so that it seemed to come from everywhere at once, a chorus of drops that had been falling for decades and would fall for decades more. The sound was deep and resonant and strangely musical, a low, continuous note that underpinned the silence of the cutting, and you listened to it for a time before turning away and walking back towards the signal box. Back inside the box, you closed the door firmly against the cold and hung your damp coat on its peg, the wool steaming faintly in the warmth of the stove. You poured a fresh cup of tea from the kettle, which was still hot, and you held the cup close to your face, letting the steam warm your cheeks and nose and the tips of your ears, which had grown numb in the cold outside. The stove had performed well while you were away, the new coals burning strongly, and the warmth of the room wrapped around you like a welcome, drawing the chill from your bones and replacing it with a slow, spreading comfort. You sat on the stool and drank the tea in small sips, feeling the heat travel down your throat and into your chest, and you let your mind drift back through the night, through the passing of the mail train and the conversations on the telegraph and the long, still hours in between. The night had been a quiet one, by the standards of the railway. There had been no emergencies, no signals failed, no trains delayed except the slow goods that had been held at Bath. The fog had been the only difficulty, and even that was not a difficulty so much as a condition to be managed. A constant presence that required more frequent checks and a greater reliance on the telegraph and the bell codes and the steady routines you had learned so long ago. You thought about the fog with a kind of detached appreciation, the way a sailor might think about the sea. It was a thing that could not be controlled, only endured and adapted to, and you had adapted to it so completely that it had become, over the course of the night, almost a companion, a silent, grey presence that shared the box with you and the stove and the clock. You thought about the morning that was still some hours away, about the walk back up the steep path to the cottage, about the breakfast you would make for yourself in the quiet kitchen, the bread and the cheese and the strong tea, the fire you would light in the small grate and the chair you would sit in while the day grew light in the small grate, and the chair you would sit in while the day grew light outside the window. You thought about the sleep that would follow, the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who had been awake all night, the blankets pulled up to your chin, the curtains drawn against the pale November sun. The thoughts were pleasant, but they were not urgent. They were simply there, drifting through your mind like the fog drifting past the window, and you let them come and go without grasping at them. The telegraph bell remained silent, the needle in the block indicator pointing steadily to line blocked, the whole system at rest. You knew that the silence would not last forever. The early morning would bring a local passenger train, and then the first of the up trains from the west, and the instruments would come alive again with their clicks and rings and the steady rhythm of the bell codes. But for now, in the deep quiet of the hour before dawn, there was nothing to do but wait, and you were content to do so. Your body warm and still, your mind calm, your eyes watching the window where the fog was just beginning, very slightly, to change its character. It was a subtle change, one that you might not have noticed if you had not been staring at the fog for so many hours. The grey was no longer the deep, uniform charcoal it had been at midnight. It had lightened by a shade, perhaps two, the way a black fabric fades over years of wear until it becomes a soft, dark grey that is no longer truly black. The change was so gradual that you could not point to the moment when it had begun. But it was there now, a faint lightening of the eastern edge of the fog, a suggestion that somewhere far above cutting the sky was beginning to think about the dawn. You watched the fog for a long time, your eyes searching for any further change, but the lightening was so slow as to be almost imperceptible, a process that would take another hour or more to complete itself. You settled back on the stool, your hands folded around the warm cup, and you waited. The patience of the night now giving way to the patience of the early morning, a different kind of patience, one that carried with it the quiet knowledge that the shift was drawing, slowly and gently, towards its close. The first indication of the coming day was not a lightening of the fog so much as a change in its texture, a subtle shift from the dense velvety grey of the deep night to something that was still grey, but now held a faint luminous quality, as if the mist itself had begun to glow from within. You noticed the change while you were sitting on the stool, your hands wrapped around the tin cup that had grown cool again, your eyes fixed on the window with the patient, unfocused gaze of a man who has been watching the same view for many hours. The darkness outside was no longer the absolute black grey it had been at midnight. It had softened by the smallest of degrees, the way a room softens when a candle is brought in from another chamber, though no candle was visible and no source of light could be identified. The signal lamps still burned their steady red and green, but their colours seemed less vivid now, as if the fog were diluting them, mixing them with the first pale hint of the day that was still far below the horizon. You rose from the stool and walked to the window, pressing your face close to the glass and cupping your hands around your eyes to block out the lantern light behind you. The fog outside was as thick as ever at ground level, but when you looked up towards the top of the cutting, you could see, or thought you could see, a faint difference in the quality of the grey where the sky should be. It was not blue, not even a lighter grey, just a grey that seemed thinner, less substantial, as if the weight of the darkness was being slowly lifted by some invisible hand. The change was so gradual that you could not be certain it was happening at all, but you had watched enough November dawns from this same window to trust your instincts. The night was ending, and the fog would soon begin to reveal the world it had hidden for so many hours. You turned from the window and attended to the small tasks that always marked the final portion of the shift, the quiet preparations for the handover that would come when the day signalman arrived. You took the kettle from the stove and filled it fresh from the stoneware jug, setting it back on the hot iron to boil for the next man's tea, a small courtesy that you extended to every signalman who relieved you. You wiped the desk with the rag, removing the fine layer of ash dust that had settled during the night, and you straightened the train register so that its corners aligned with the edge of the shelf. The pen you cleaned and set in its groove, the inkwell you checked and found still half full, the blotting paper you replaced with a fresh sheet from the drawer beneath the desk. Each action was performed without hurry, with the same calm attention you had given to every task during the long night, because the end of a shift was as important as its beginning, the smooth transition from one man to the next being one of the principles upon which the railway was built. The stove had burned well through the coldest hours, and the bed of coals was still glowing with a deep, steady heat. You added one final lump of coal, a small piece that would keep the fire alive until the dayman could attend to it, and you closed the door and set the damper to a moderate position, ensuring that the box would remain warm for the next occupant. The kettle began to simmer with a low, pleasant sound, and you stood by the stove for a moment, feeling its warmth against your legs, listening to the quiet bubbling of the water, there would soon be tea for the man who was even now, perhaps, walking down the steep path towards the cutting. The fog continued to lighten as you watched, the process now unmistakable, even though it was still achingly slow. The window, which had been a blank grey square for most of the night, now showed the faint outline of the signal post against the sky, a dark vertical shape that emerged from the mist like a pencil line drawn on wet paper. The post had been invisible for so long that its reappearance felt like the return of an old friend, a familiar landmark that restored your sense of place and proportion. The signal lamps, which had seemed to float unsupported in the grey, were now visibly attached to the post, their brackets and the curve of the spectacle plates coming into focus as the fog thinned. The red and green glows were still burning, but they had paled in the growing light, their urgency reduced as the day approached. Beyond the signal post, the walls of the cutting began to reveal themselves, slowly and by degrees, as if the fog were a curtain being drawn back 1 inch at a time. The limestone faces emerged first as darker patches within the grey, then as definite vertical surfaces, streaked with vertical stains of darker moisture, and finally as the textured layered rock you knew so well, its cracks and ledges and small tufts of fern becoming visible one by one. The ferns were the same deep green they had been the previous afternoon, their fronds drooping under the weight of the condensed moisture, and the moss that clung to the crevices was a brilliant saturated emerald that seemed almost to glow in the soft diffuse light of the early morning. The cutting was waking up, its features returning from the fog like memories returning after sleep. You opened the window a little wider, the crack now a gap of several inches, and the air that came in was cold and fresh and smelled of wet stone and wet earth, and the clean, mineral scent of the limestone. The dripping of the water was louder now, the individual drops falling more frequently as the temperature rose a fraction of a degree and the moss released its stored moisture, and the sound was a bright, musical plinking that filled the cutting with a quiet, cheerful rhythm. A light breeze had begun to move through the cutting, the first breeze you had felt all night, and it stirred the remaining fog into slow, rolling billows that drifted along the track bed and curled around the base of the signal post. The breeze was gentle, barely strong enough to move the fronds of the ferns, but it was enough to break up the stagnant air that had sat in the cutting for so many hours, and you breathed it in deeply, feeling the last traces of drowsiness clear from your mind. The telegraph bell rang, a single, clear note that was surprisingly loud in the morning. Quiet, and you turned from the window to answer it. The signal was from the box towards Chippenham, and it was the bell code for an up-local passenger train entering the section, the first train of the morning from that direction. You acknowledged the signal with a single beat on the key, and then you walked to the lever frame and pulled the distant signal lever towards you, setting the green light for the approaching train. The lever moved with its familiar heavy smoothness, and you felt the distant resistance of the signal arm dropping into the clear position, a solid, reassuring sensation that travelled up through the iron and into your hand. The local passenger was an early train, the kind that carried workers and market-goers and people travelling short distances, and it would pass through the cutting at a modest speed, its engine already beginning to slow for the station beyond. You stood by the window and watched the fog continue to thin as the train approached. The sound of the engine reached you before the train itself, a light, quick chuffing that was very different from the deep roar of the night mail, a cheerful, almost jaunty rhythm that suited the morning. The headlamp of the locomotive appeared as a yellow glow in the mist, growing brighter and more defined until the engine emerged from the fog, its paintwork glistening with condensation, its brass fittings dulled by the damp. The driver was visible in the cab, a different man from the one who had passed in the night, and he raised a hand in greeting as he approached the box, a casual, informal salute that you returned with a nod and a small lift of your own hand. The local train was shorter than the mail, only 3 carriages and a guard's van, and it passed the window with a soft, whisking sound, its passengers visible through the windows, faces tired or indifferent or staring out at the foggy cutting, their thoughts already on the day ahead. You pulled the levers back to danger as the tail lamp disappeared towards the west, the red light bright and clear in the thinning fog, and you sent the bell code for train out of section, the rhythm of the beats crisp and precise. Then you made the final entry in the train register, the nib of the pen scratching out the time and the train details, and the words fog lifting, visibility improving. The ink was black and fresh, and you blotted it carefully before closing the ledger for the last time during this shift. The clock on the wall showed a few minutes past 6, and you knew that the day signalman would be arriving soon, his boots crunching down the steep path, his breath clouding in the cold morning air. You poured the tea from the kettle into the clean tin cup you had set aside for him, the steam rising in a thick white curl, and you placed the cup on the shelf near the window where he would see it when he came in. Then you took your coat from the peg and put it on, buttoning it up to your chin, and you gathered your canvas bag with its empty flask and the remains of your food wrapped in paper. The signal box was tidy and warm, the instruments at rest, the fire burning steadily in the stove, everything ready for the man who would take over the watch. You saw him before you heard him, a dark shape moving down the path through the last ribbons of fog that still clung to the upper part of the cutting. He was a solid, broad-shouldered man named Davies, and he walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who had been doing this walk for many years and had no need to hurry. You opened the door as he reached the bottom of the path, and he raised a hand in greeting, his face red from the cold, his breath coming in short white puffs. Davies stamped his feet on the gravel outside the door, knocking the moisture from his boots, and then he stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold fresh air with him. "Morning," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse from the cold. "Fog's lifting at last." You nodded, stepping aside to let him into the small space. "It was thick all night," you said. "The mail passed on time, and the slow goods at 2:45. Everything else was quiet." Your voice was calm and even, the voice of a man who has been awake all night but has not been strained by it. Davies took off his cap and hung it on the peg next to your coat, and he saw the cup of tea you had left for him on the shelf. "You've made tea," he said, and there was a note of simple appreciation in his voice. He picked up the cup and took a sip, the steam fogging his face for a moment. "Kettle's still hot," you said. "The distance signals at danger, blocks at line blocked, and the register's up to date. There's nothing special to report." "I'll check the lamps when the fog clears properly," Davies said, and he settled onto the stool with the air of a man settling into his own home, his hands wrapping around the warm cup, his eyes already scanning the instruments and the window, with the automatic attention of a signalman beginning his shift. You stood by the door for a moment, your bag in your hand, watching Davies as he made the small adjustments that every signalman made when taking over, checking the position of the levers, glancing at the block indicator, leaning forward to look out at the signal post that was now clearly visible against the pale grey sky. The cutting outside was fully revealed now, the limestone walls wet and glistening, the ferns and mosses bright green against the dark stone, the rails shining with moisture as they curved towards the tunnel mouth. The fog had lifted to a thin, high mist that hung above the top of the cutting, and through it you could see the pale, watery disk of the November sun, its light weak but definite, a promise that the day would soon be properly light. "I'll be off then," you said, and Davies raised a hand without turning from the window, a brief, friendly gesture that was all the farewell the situation required. You stepped out of the signal box and closed the door behind you, the warmth of the cabin giving way to the cool, damp air of the cutting. The gravel crunched under your boots as you walked to the bottom of the path, and you paused there for a moment, looking back at the small wooden box with its glowing window and its tall signal post standing guard beside it. The red and green lamps were still burning, though they would soon be extinguished by Davies when the daylight was strong enough, and the smoke from the stovepipe rose in a thin grey column that joined the last of the fog and disappeared. The box looked exactly as it had looked when you arrived the previous afternoon. A small dark cabin in the depths of the cutting, and you felt the quiet satisfaction of a job completed without incident. A shift that had passed, as shifts should pass, in calm and order and the slow, steady rhythm of the railway. You turned and began the climb up the steep path, your boots finding the familiar footholds in the packed earth and loose stones. The path was slippery with moisture, and you climbed slowly, one hand out for balance, your breath forming clouds of white vapor in the cold air. As you climbed, the cutting fell away below you, its walls receding until the signal box was just a small rectangle of dark wood at the bottom of a great stone trench. The rails, two silver lines that curved towards the black arch of the tunnel and the distant countryside beyond. The fog was now a thin, high veil that softened the tops of the hills and the bare branches of the trees, and through it the sun was a pale gold coin hanging low in the eastern sky, its light catching the moisture on every surface and turning the world into a landscape of soft, muted colors, grays and greens and the dark brown of the winter fields. By the time you reached the top of the path, the cutting was no longer visible, hidden behind the shoulder of the hill, and you were standing on the open lane that led back to the cottage. The lane was lined with hedgerows that were beaded with droplets of water, each bead catching the morning light and sparkling with a brief, tiny brilliance. A rook called from somewhere in the fields, a harsh, solitary note that was the first bird sound you had heard since the owl many hours before. And a cart was moving on a distant road, its wheels making a low, grinding rumble that drifted across the still air. The world above the cutting was waking up, its people stirring in their cottages, their fires being lit, their kettles being filled, and you walked through this waking world with the slow, steady pace of a man who had done his work and was going home to rest. The cottage came into view after a short walk, its stone walls dark with moisture, its chimney sending up a thin curl of smoke from the fire you had banked the previous afternoon. You opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of the small kitchen meeting you, the lingering scent of yesterday's bread, and the faint, pleasant mustiness of a house that was lived in but not fussy. You hung your coat on the hook by the door, set your canvas bag on the table, and crossed to the stove where the fire was still alive, a bed of glowing embers that you coaxed back into flame with a few small sticks and a lump of coal. You filled the kettle from the jug on the dresser and set it on the stove, and while the water heated, you cut a slice of bread from the loaf and a piece of cheese from the block wrapped in muslin, the simple breakfast you always ate after a night shift. You sat at the small wooden table by the window, eating slowly, looking out at the garden where the fog was lifting from the grass and the bare branches of the apple tree were beginning to catch the morning light. The tea was strong and hot, and it warmed you from the inside as the fire warmed you from the outside, and you felt the deep, quiet tiredness that came at the end of every shift settle over you like a heavy blanket, not unpleasant, just the body's way of saying that it was time to rest. You finished the bread and the cheese, washed the plate and the cup in the basin, and then you climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom, where the curtains were drawn and the bed was waiting, its blankets turned down, its pillows plump and white. You undressed slowly, folding your clothes over the chair, and you climbed into the bed, the sheets cold for only a moment before your body's warmth began to spread through them. You lay on your side, your head on the pillow, your eyes already closing, and you listened to the sounds of the cottage, the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, the crackle of the fire in the stove, the distant muted call of the rook from the fields. Outside, the November morning was taking hold, the fog finally gone, the sun rising higher in the pale grey sky, and the cutting far below was quiet and safe under the watchful eye of Davies, who was sitting in the signal box with his tea and his instruments, carrying on the same patient, steady work that you had carried on through the night. You thought of the mail train far away now in Bristol or beyond, of the sleeping passengers who had passed your window, of the signal lamps burning their red and green through the thickest fog, and the thoughts were calm and peaceful, drifting through your mind like the last wisps of mist drifting over the hill. Then the thoughts dissolved, and there was only the warmth of the bed and the soft rhythm of your breathing and the deep, restful sleep that came to a man who had kept his watch through the long November night and had kept it well.